Section 1. The Lights of Quahog. There is something about a town you know so well that it starts to feel like home, even when you have never actually been there. A town where the same bar has been open since the late 90s, where the houses on one particular street seem never to change in any meaningful way, where a slightly too loud man keeps doing exactly the kind of thing you always expect him to do, and somehow that predictability becomes its own form of comfort. Not the comfort of novelty or surprise, but the deeper and stranger comfort of recognition. The comfort of a world that stays where you left it. Quahog, Rhode Island doesn't actually exist on any map. You can't find it on a GPS, no bus route runs there, no highway sign is marked with its name. It occupies no physical space anywhere on the surface of the earth. And yet for millions of people who grew up watching a particular animated family live their chaotic and ridiculous and occasionally deeply strange lives on a television screen, that town feels as real as any place they have actually visited. More real, sometimes, in the specific way that fictional places become real when you have spent enough time inside them. Family Guy first appeared on the 31st of January 1999, following Super Bowl 33, which was itself one of the most watched television events of the year. Around 22 million people happened to be sitting in front of their televisions that night when a new show began, one created by a young animator named Seth MacFarlane, who had studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and had previously worked on cartoons like Johnny Bravo and Dexter's Laboratory. Those 22 million people met a family that night who would, in one form or another, never quite leave popular culture again. Peter Griffin, round and beery and somehow magnetic despite every reasonable objection. Lois, his patient and increasingly exasperated wife. Meg, their teenage daughter who just wanted to be noticed. Chris, their good-natured but foggy son. Brian, the family dog who spoke in full sentences and drank martinis. And Stewie, the baby in the football-shaped head who appeared to be planning something terrible. That first night, something clicked. And then it didn't click for years, at least not commercially. Fox shuffled the show around the schedule with what can only be described as casual cruelty, pitting it against established powerhouses on competing networks, never giving it the consistent home it needed to build an audience. By 2002, after 3 seasons, Fox canceled Family Guy for the first time. It seemed like the show was done, but it wasn't done, far from it. What happened next is the kind of story that television historians still bring up as one of the stranger comeback narratives in the medium's history. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air reruns of the show on their Adult Swim block, acquiring them cheaply because at the time nobody thought the show had much remaining value. The reruns began in 2003, and almost immediately, Family Guy became the most watched program on the entire block. Adult Swim's viewership grew by 239% off the back of those reruns. Simultaneously, DVD sets for the first and second seasons went on sale and moved over 400,000 copies. People weren't just watching the old episodes, they were buying them. They were sharing them. They were building an entirely new and fiercely loyal audience for a show that had already been canceled, Fox noticed. By 2004, they ordered new episodes. Family Guy returned to television in 2005 for its 4th season, and the celebration among fans was genuine and loud. The show had come back from the dead, and for years and years after that, it kept going. More than 20 seasons, hundreds of episodes. A cast of characters that became so deeply embedded in popular culture that they showed up on merchandise, in video games, at Halloween, in internet memes before anyone really knew what internet memes were going to become. The show became one of the most syndicated and streamed animated programs in the world. It was messy and inconsistent and sometimes brilliant and sometimes truly baffling, but it was always, somehow, there. Shows that last that long, that sink that deeply into a culture's shared imagination, do something interesting. They accumulate questions, not just plot questions, though there are certainly plenty of those, deeper questions, structural questions. Questions about what is actually happening in the world these characters inhabit, about what the stranger and more unexplained elements of the show might actually mean if you stopped taking them at face value and started looking at them from a different angle. Why does almost nobody react normally to a dog who speaks like a middle-aged intellectual? Why does a baby genius who speaks with a refined British accent and builds advanced weaponry sometimes go completely unheard? How does Peter Griffin absorb the kind of physical punishment that would leave a real person in a hospital for months and walk away from it looking entirely unbothered by the following week? Why do the characters themselves seem to change so drastically between the early years and the later ones, becoming harder, stranger, and less like themselves? These are the questions that sent people to forums and discussion threads and Reddit posts at 2 in the morning, staring at their screens and building elaborate explanations that the show itself never offered. Fan theories. Some of them are playful. Some of them are remarkably well constructed, drawing on specific details from across seasons to support a reading of the show that the casual viewer would never consider. And some of them are so dark, so quietly devastating in their implications, that they fundamentally change the feeling of watching the show once you've heard them. Tonight, we're going to sit with all of them. Every significant theory that the Family Guy fan community has constructed over more than 2.5 decades. We're going to move through them slowly, letting each one unfold, examining the evidence that fans have gathered to support these ideas, and thinking about what it means if any of them happen to be true. The lights of Quahog are on. The drunken clam is open. Brian is somewhere with a martini, probably writing the first page of something he'll never finish. Stewie is building something in the nursery. Peter is watching television, or causing a problem, or possibly both. And there are things happening in this town that the show never quite explained. If you're settling in right now, whether it's late at night, early in the morning, or somewhere in the quiet space between, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if this kind of deep, slow exploration of a show you love sounds like exactly your thing, subscribe so you never miss one. Now, let's go deeper. Section 2. Peter's Broken World, the darkest theory of all. The theory we're going to start with is not the most elaborate fan theory that exists around Family Guy. It's not the one with the most moving parts, or the one that requires the deepest knowledge of specific episodes and throwaway lines. But it is, in the judgment of a remarkable number of people who have encountered it, the one that lands the hardest. It first appeared on Reddit in August of 2012, posted by a user called B-0308 to the site's Fan Theories community, and it accumulated more than 540 upvotes over the following decade. When it resurfaced on TikTok in late 2022, people shared it with the kind of stunned, slightly reluctant enthusiasm that really uncomfortable ideas tend to generate. The comments on those posts were full of people saying they wished they'd never read it, which, of course, only made more people read it. The theory goes like this. The show that we watch, the cartoon about the Griffin family in Rhode Island, with the time machines and the chicken fights and the cutaway jokes and the talking dog and the evil baby, none of it is actually happening. What we are watching is not a story about a real family. What we are watching is the interior of a broken man's mind. To understand the theory, you have to back up and imagine a world that the show never shows us, the real world. In this version of events, Peter Griffin is not a cartoon man. He's a real person, living in Rhode Island with a wife and children he loves. His daughter Meg is not the awkward, unpopular girl we know from the show. In this version, Meg is beautiful. She's popular. She's the kind of girl who lights up a room when she walks in. She is also deeply caring toward her younger brother Chris, who in this version of reality has a cognitive disability. Chris was starved of oxygen at birth, and the resulting condition means he's always needed a little more help, a little more attention, a little more patience. Meg gives it to him willingly. She loves her brother. One night, Meg decides to take Chris to a party. She wants him to have the experience of going out, of being included, of feeling like a regular teenager for a few hours. At the party, things go wrong in the way things sometimes do at teenage parties, when adult supervision is absent. Meg drinks too much. When the time comes to leave and get Chris home safe, she makes the decision that countless teenagers have made to their horror, and she gets behind the wheel of a car while intoxicated. The crash kills them both. Peter's wife Lois is pregnant at this point. They are expecting their third child together, the baby who would have been Stewie. Lois receives the news of her children's deaths and is unable to carry it. Already deep in her grief, she takes her own life, taking with her the unborn child she was carrying. Peter survives all of it. He is alive and intact in the physical sense, while being completely shattered in every other sense. He loses his daughter. He loses his son. He loses his wife. He loses his unborn child. In a matter of days, the entire world he built his life around is gone. He is found eventually in a mental hospital. Cleveland, who in the show is one of Peter's closest friends, visits him there in the real world. But what Cleveland finds when he visits his friend is a man who has retreated so far into his own mind that the real world barely seems to register. Peter has built a replacement, a dream, a fantasy, a place where everyone is still alive. The show we watch is that dream. This explains things that the show itself never quite explains. It explains why Meg is treated so terribly by Peter and the rest of the family. In the real world, Peter loved Meg deeply. But inside his broken mind, the guilt and the resentment he feels toward her for the accident has warped her image entirely. The beautiful, caring daughter has become the ugly, rejected one. She becomes the target of his unconscious rage, the figure onto whom he projects all the pain he cannot otherwise process. Every insult Peter throws at Meg, every moment of dismissal and cruelty that fans of the show have cataloged over decades, is, in the context of this theory, a man's grief turned inward and reshapen into something uglier than grief. It explains Stewie. Peter never met his third child. The pregnancy was cut short before the child could be born, before Peter could hold him or know him. So when Peter's mind constructs a version of Stewie for the dream, he builds the child he imagined, the child he hoped for. He builds a brilliant, extraordinary, wildly capable child, a genius, a prodigy, a baby who can build time machines and weather control devices and speak in precise, elegant sentences. Stewie's extraordinary intelligence is a father's love shaped into fantasy. The child Peter never got to raise is imagined as the most remarkable child who ever lived. And Stewie's obsession with killing Lois, the recurring motif of those early seasons where the baby endlessly plots against his mother, carries its own dark logic inside this framework. In the real world, Peter's resentment of Lois is profound. She took her own life. She left him alone with all of it. Whatever compassion he might feel for her grief, whatever understanding he might have for why she did what she did, is tangled up with a deep, wordless fury. In his mind's version of Stewie, that fury finds a voice. The baby wants to destroy the woman. The unborn child is given his absent father's unprocessed anger to carry. Chris in the dream is not the cognitively disabled boy he was in reality. In Peter's reconstruction, Chris becomes simply childlike, innocent, amiable, a bit foggy and slow, but harmless and good. Peter cannot fix what happened to Chris in the real world. But in the dream, Chris is free. Even Peter's own stupidity and childishness carries meaning here. In the real world, according to the theory, Peter Griffin was not a foolish man. He was a decent, reasonably intelligent person who worked and loved his family and did his best. But guilt is corrosive. Deep, catastrophic guilt, the kind that comes from believing, somewhere beneath consciousness, that you should have been able to prevent what happened, that a better father would have stopped Meg from getting in that car, that a better husband would have been able to reach Lois in her darkest moment, does something to a person's self-image. Peter, in his dream, has made himself small. He has made himself incapable of adult responsibility. He has made himself a man-child who causes problems and gets into absurd situations, but never, ultimately, has to face the weight of real consequences. In Peter's dream, things are always fine by next week. Someone gets hurt and they're okay again. The family fights and then they make up. The world ends and then it turns out it was a dream. Reality never sticks because if reality stuck, Peter would have to acknowledge what his reality actually is. A hospital bed, empty rooms, names on headstones that should not be there. The extended version of the theory on the Spin Pasta wiki, which elaborates on the original Reddit post in considerable detail, adds one more layer that is worth sitting with. It addresses why Cleveland stops appearing in the later seasons and is eventually given his own spin-off show. In the extended reading, Cleveland visits Peter in the hospital repeatedly in the early years, genuinely trying to maintain the connection. But each time he visits, he finds himself being pulled into Peter's dream, finding himself starting to respond to the fantasies his friend constructs as though they are real. Alarmed by what is happening to his own grip on reality, Cleveland eventually stops visiting. He creates distance. He moves away. And in the logic of Peter's dream, the Cleveland who was always there becomes a Cleveland who leaves for a spin-off, present in the narrative but no longer at the center of it. There are details in the show that fans point to as quiet, unintentional support for this reading. The show's total lack of consequences, the ability of the characters to sustain injuries that would be lethal in any realistic context and then walk away from them, the way Peter's behavior grows more extreme and more removed from anything recognizably human as the seasons progress, the moments of genuine tenderness and compassion that Peter occasionally shows Meg before snapping back to cruelty, all of these land differently once you've been inside this theory. The moments of tenderness toward Meg are particularly striking. Over the course of the show, there are scattered episodes where Peter seems to remember something, where he looks at his daughter with something other than contempt, where he reaches out, where he apologizes. These moments always evaporate, always reset, always get swallowed by the next week's attitude. Inside this theory, they are exactly what they look like. The real Peter, the one who loved his daughter, surfacing briefly through the dream before the guilt pulls him back under. Some people who encounter this theory find it uncomfortably convincing, not because any individual piece of evidence is airtight, because it's a fan theory about a cartoon, and none of the evidence is meant to be airtight, but because it organizes things that have always felt slightly off about the show into a reading that actually makes emotional sense. It turns the show's most disturbing elements, the cruelty toward Meg, the consequence-free chaos, the way Peter seems to drift further from human norms as the seasons continue, into something coherent rather than simply lazy. It gives the darkness a reason. It's worth noting that this theory doesn't actually require the show to have intended any of this. Fan theories often operate in the space between what was intentional and what was accidental, finding meaning in patterns that the creators may never have considered. Whether Seth MacFarlane and the writers were building a dream logic into the show by design, or whether a fan in 2012 just happened to notice that the pieces fit together this way, the theory works either way. It illuminates something about the show, whether it was placed there deliberately or not. The question, once you've sat inside this theory for a while, is whether you find it comforting or devastating, because there are two ways to read it. One is simply dark. A man lost everything, lost his mind, and what we've been watching for all these years is the inside of his broken grief. But the other reading is something more complicated. In Peter's dream, everyone he loves is alive. His daughter is there, even if she is a distorted version of herself. His wife is there, his sons are there. The baby he never got to meet is there, building extraordinary machines in a yellow nursery. In the dream, they are all together. Every week, regardless of what happens, they are together. Maybe that's the real reason nothing in this show ever truly ends. The dream has to keep going. If it stops, he wakes up. Section 3. The world according to Stewie. When an infant perceives everything, step back for a moment and consider something that has never quite been resolved in over 25 years of the show's existence. The question of who can actually understand Stewie Griffin. It seems like it should have a simple answer. He's a character on a television show. He speaks, he's funny, move on. But when you watch the show with this specific question in mind, something strange and slightly dizzying becomes apparent. The answer is not consistent. At all. In some episodes, Stewie speaks directly to adults and they react to what he's said. In other episodes, adults walk right past him while he delivers complete, complex monologues and they show no sign of having heard a single word. Brian hears him almost always. Other members of the family hear him when the episode needs them to and don't hear him when the episode doesn't. The show seems aware that this is a problem, and it has even sort of addressed it on occasion, including a fourth-wall breaking moment where Stewie himself jokes that nobody can figure out whether or not people can hear him. But the inconsistency is never actually explained. Unless, of course, there's a reason for it that has nothing to do with inconsistent writing. The theory, originally posted by a Reddit user under the handle iFornication, proposes something that is quietly radical. The entire show is being filtered through Stewie's perception. Not Peter's grief, as in the previous theory, but Stewie's experience. What we are watching is how a 1-year-old baby perceives and processes the world around him. At first, this sounds strange. A baby's perception producing a world with time machines and giant chicken fights and celebrity cameos and elaborate political satire? But sit with the logic of it for a moment, because it holds together in some genuinely interesting ways. An infant, even a highly intelligent one, has an extremely limited framework for understanding the world. They can identify the emotional states of the people around them, often with remarkable accuracy, but they interpret those states through the narrow lens of their own experience. The people in a baby's life are huge, looming, overwhelming presences who feel intensely real and immediately important, but are understood only in terms of how they relate to the infant's own needs and feelings. Peter, from Stewie's perspective, is a large, loud, physically overwhelming presence who engages with Stewie in ways that are playful but slightly chaotic. He makes big movements. He makes loud noises. He's unpredictable. To a baby processing this presence, that translates in the dream logic of infant perception as a man who is fundamentally foolish and impulsive. The exaggerated stupidity isn't a character flaw the writers invented. It's how a baby who doesn't have the cognitive framework to understand adult competence perceives his loud, physically imposing father. Lois is the person who imposes structure. She's the one who says no, who redirects, who corrects, who disciplines. She's the one who puts Stewie in the high chair, takes away the thing he wanted, says it's time to sleep when sleep is the last thing he wants. To an infant constructing a model of the world, that presence becomes an adversarial one, the arch nemesis of his existence, the person who thwarts his desires. Stewie's hatred of Lois, his obsession with undermining and destroying her, is not the psychology of a cartoon villain in this reading. It is the psychology of an infant who experiences his mother as the primary obstacle between himself and everything he wants. Meg, seen through the eyes of a baby, is the older sibling who moves through the house looking stressed and unhappy, who fights with her parents, who doesn't seem to fit easily into the family's emotional rhythms. A baby doesn't understand the nuances of teenage social anxiety and the specific miseries of adolescence. What they register is the emotional tenor. And what Stewie's infant mind registers is that this person in the house seems sad and rejected, seems to be treated differently from the other adults. The perception that Meg is treated badly by everyone around her, the constant mockery and dismissal that defines her treatment in the show, is exactly how an infant would perceive an unhappy older sibling. Chris is the sibling who plays, who goofs around, who approaches Stewie with a kind of uncomplicated cheerfulness. He's not threatening, not imposing, not particularly interesting in a complex way. He's just there, occasionally fun, not much of a presence. Hence Chris's relatively simple characterization. And then there's Brian. Brian, in the real world, is a dog. He makes sounds. He's a pet. He doesn't talk. But here's where the theory becomes most compelling. The theorist's central argument is that Brian can talk in the show because Stewie doesn't understand that Brian isn't talking. To an infant who hasn't yet learned the categorical distinction between humans who speak and animals who don't, Brian is just another being in the household. He's present, he's engaged, he seems to respond when Stewie makes sounds. In Stewie's perception, Brian is a person. The barking that everyone else hears is, in Stewie's processing, being translated into something that feels like language, like connection, like conversation. This is why Brian is the only character who consistently interacts with Stewie in ways that feel mutual. Everyone else is caught in the gap between what they actually say and what Stewie's perception reconstructs as meaning. Brian gets through because Stewie has categorized him as someone whose sounds are meant to be understood. The theory also explains the wildly inconsistent problem of who can hear Stewie's speech at any given moment. When Stewie appears to be making sounds that adults respond to, it may be coincidence, those adults happening to say or do something that Stewie's infant mind interprets as a response. When Stewie's elaborate statements go unacknowledged, it may be because they were never actually said, not out loud. They were only ever happening in the interior of a baby who is sitting in his crib, or in his high chair, or on the floor of the living room, babbling in the way that babies do while constructing a rich and complex inner world. The weaponry and the machinery and the time travel are all part of this interior landscape. A baby's imagination, especially a very young child who has not yet learned the limits of what is possible, is boundless in a way that an adult's almost never is. The objects around Stewie, his toys, the things in the nursery, the shapes and colors and textures of the world are all raw material for a mind that hasn't yet learned what those objects are supposed to do. So they become something else. The crib becomes a battle station. The mobile above him becomes a navigational instrument. The random sounds from the television downstairs become intelligence briefings. The big plastic toy in the corner of the room becomes, in a way that only Stewie's perception can fully translate, a functional time machine. And the things Stewie builds that actually seem to work in the show, the things that appear to have real effects on the world around him, those are the moments where the theory gets slightly wobbly. But the theorist's response to this is that not all of those effects are necessarily happening in the way the show presents them. Some of what we see as a result of Stewie's inventions may be coincidence, given the shape of causality by Stewie's perception. Some may be events that happened for entirely unrelated reasons that Stewie's mind has woven into the narrative of his own plan. There's a particular episode that fans point to as inadvertent evidence for this theory. In one episode, Stewie is present at a church service and makes a very crude comment out loud. For the entire episode, nobody responds to his comments. They behave as though he's made no sound at all. But Brian, who is also present, does react. In the logic of the infant perception theory, this is a perfect illustration of the dynamic at work. Brian and Stewie are both in some sense outside the normal channels of communication. Brian because he's a dog, Stewie because he's an infant making sounds that adults have learned to filter out. Their communication happens in a register that the rest of the episode's characters can't access. There's something almost tender about this reading of the show. What it describes is a baby who is profoundly intelligent and imaginative and desperately, urgently trying to understand the enormous and confusing world he's been born into. Every episode, every adventure, every brilliant scheme is a child working through what the world is and how he fits into it. The show's most elaborate and fantastical elements, the ones that stretch logic past the breaking point, are the product of a very young mind that hasn't yet learned that logic is supposed to be a constraint. And the friendship between Stewie and Brian, the show's longest and most emotionally resonant relationship, becomes something different under this lens. It becomes the connection between a baby and the dog he loves, the thing he reaches for, the thing that always seems to understand him, the thing that's always there in the quiet hours when the rest of the house is asleep and the world is dark and the only sounds are the ones the two of them make for each other. If the show is happening inside Stewie's head, then it is, in its most fundamental form, the story of an infant learning to make sense of a world that is very large and very strange and full of people who are more complicated than anyone his age can fully understand. That's not disturbing. That might actually be beautiful. Section 4. The Dog, Who Was Never a Dog. Brian Griffin's Hidden Origin. Brian Griffin is one of the most unusual characters in the history of animated television, and not just because he's a dog who walks upright and holds a martini glass and comments on postmodern literature. He's unusual because the show has never convincingly explained why he is the way he is. The other Griffin family members, however exaggerated, however pushed past what real people would do, are at least operating within the basic framework of humans being human. Brian is different. He's fundamentally different. Different in a way that the show acknowledges through comedy but has never really accounted for. Why is Brian the way Brian is? The most casual response, the one the show itself sort of leans on when it bothers to address the question at all, is that he's just a funny dog. It's a cartoon. It's a joke. Don't look for a reason because there isn't one. But there's a large and dedicated portion of the fan base that finds this response deeply unsatisfying. And the cross-show evidence from the broader McFarlane universe has given those fans a theory that is strikingly well supported. Brian Griffin is not actually a dog in any meaningful sense. Brian Griffin is, or was, a human being whose consciousness was transferred into a canine body by the CIA. Before you dismiss this as too wild to be worth considering, let's start with the evidence from the McFarlane universe itself, because it's more direct than you might expect. In American Dad, one of Seth MacFarlane's other shows and one that exists in explicitly the same universe as Family Guy, there is a character named Klaus. Klaus is the Smith family's pet goldfish. He speaks in full sentences. He has opinions, desires, a sense of humor, a complex emotional life. He is, in every way that matters, a person. And Klaus's origin is explained clearly in the show. Klaus was a German Olympic ski jumper whose brain was transplanted into the body of a goldfish by the CIA during the Cold War. The CIA used this technology as part of their espionage operations, transferring human consciousness into inconspicuous animal bodies that could be placed in sensitive locations without arousing suspicion. The procedure is confirmed as real and operational within the logic of the shared McFarlane universe. There is also in American Dad a character named Reggie the Koala, who is one of CIA Director Avery Bullock's colleagues. Reggie is a koala. He also speaks, reasons, and operates as a person. His origin is never as explicitly spelled out as Klaus's, but within the pattern of talking animals in this universe, the implication is clear: another human consciousness in an animal body. The fan theory argues that Brian Griffin's origin is identical. The CIA, operating in the same universe that all of these shows share, transferred a human brain into the body of a dog. The specific backstory of whose brain it was and why has been the subject of extended forum speculation. The most common version suggests the human who became Brian was young, possibly a child, whose consciousness was placed in a puppy's body. This would explain why Brian, despite his considerable intelligence and sophistication, has some emotional patterns that feel more adolescent than adult. He's been in this body for a long time, probably since before he can clearly remember being anything else. The human memories may be faded or absent. What remains is the intellect, the emotional complexity, the capacity for language and culture and loneliness that goes beyond what a dog's nervous system would normally produce. The theory also offers an explanation for Ernie the giant chicken, the enormous rooster who appears periodically throughout the series to engage Peter in extended, increasingly brutal, and fundamentally unexplained combat. The fights between Peter and Ernie are legendary moments in Family Guy's history, extended sequences of cartoon violence that pause the episode's plot entirely, while these two figures destroy entire city blocks in the course of their brawl. The show never explains why these fights happen or why they escalate to the degree they do. In the CIA experiment reading, Ernie is another subject. Another consciousness in an animal body, possibly one whose procedure went less cleanly than Brian's, whose human memories are more fragmented, whose behavior is correspondingly more erratic. The grudge between Peter and Ernie, whatever it originated in, is being carried by something that used to be a person and can no longer process its own history clearly. The Brian as writer variation of this theory adds another layer. A separate fan theory posted by Reddit user Ra-Ah-Afi proposes that Brian is the actual author of Family Guy. He's the one writing the show. The world of Quahog, as we experience it, is Brian's creation, Brian's perspective shaping and exaggerating, and constructing the narrative. The evidence cited includes the fact that Brian shares so many of Seth MacFarlane's own political and ideological positions that the show's universe is filtered through a liberal, atheist, culturally literate perspective that matches Brian's stated worldview almost exactly. In this version, Brian's failings as a writer within the show become a form of meta-commentary. The show that Brian is writing, the fictional Family Guy within the fictional world, is itself imperfect. It has the same tendencies toward excess and inconsistency that have been widely noted about the actual show. The cutaways go on too long because Brian's writing is self-indulgent. The characters behave inconsistently because Brian is not a reliable narrator. The moments of genuine heart and emotional resonance, scattered among the louder and cruder material, are the moments when Brian's real ability breaks through. And Brian's alcoholism, examined through the lens of the CIA experiment theory, becomes almost unbearably poignant. A human consciousness in an animal body, living out an extended life that is biologically shorter than what any human would experience, watching everyone around him age and change while he himself ages faster, unable to fully integrate into the human world because he is not technically human, unable to simply be a dog because he is not that either. He drinks because he is caught in a category that doesn't exist. He is the thing that the scientific literature has no name for, the human who became something else and is trying to figure out how to live with that. The fact that the show killed Brian in season 12 and then brought him back 2 episodes later, the fact that his death was treated as a significant narrative event before being undone with minimal ceremony, reads differently in the CIA experiment context. An ordinary dog's death would be sad but unremarkable. The death of something that used to be a person, however, the ending of a consciousness that began as human, carries a different moral weight. The show fumbled it either way, in the eyes of most critics. But the fumbling lands differently depending on what you believe Brian actually is. One more piece of circumstantial evidence that the more careful theorists point to. In Family Guy's 6th season, there is a 2-part episode in which Stewie finally, definitively kills Lois and then rules the world, before it's all revealed to be a simulation on Stewie's computer. The climax of that simulation shows Stewie in global dominance, with Brian by his side as a trusted advisor. In an episode of Road to the Multiverse, an alternate universe is shown, where dogs are the dominant species and humans are kept as pets. In that universe, the version of Brian who exists there is a wealthy, comfortable member of society, while the human version of Peter is the family dog. It's a throwaway joke, meant to be funny for about 90 seconds, but in the CIA experiment framework, it carries an edge. Because in a universe where that power dynamic is reversed, Brian is exactly where a human consciousness in a dog's body always wanted to be. Back where he belongs. Section 5. 2 shows, 2 realities. The parallel universe theory. There is a particular episode that fan theorists point to again and again as evidence for one of the most structurally ambitious theories in the show's history. The episode is called Back to the Pilot, and it aired in Season 10 of Family Guy. In it, Brian and Stewie use Stewie's time machine to travel back to the first episode of the show. They observe the version of the Griffin family that existed in 1999, before the show was canceled, before the 3-year gap, before the revival. And what they find disturbs them, though in a way that the episode plays mostly for laughs. The characters they observe are different. Not radically different, not unrecognizably different, but different in the specific ways that fans who remember the early episodes remember. The dialogue is different. The attitudes are different. The family feels different. And Brian, watching his earlier self, watches a version of himself that is, in several important respects, a person he no longer is. The episode's joke is about the weirdness of time travel and the show's own awareness of its history. But the fan theory built around this episode argues that the weirdness has a deeper explanation than the show itself acknowledges. Brian and Stewie did not travel back in time in that episode. They traveled to a parallel universe. The theory was put forward by Reddit user HoHoSwackyQuest, and it is one of the most widely discussed structural theories in the Family Guy fan community. The central argument is straightforward. The Family Guy that aired from 1999 to 2002, the original 3 seasons before cancellation, and the Family Guy that returned in 2005 and has continued ever since, are not the same show in any meaningful continuity. They are different universes. The evidence is substantial, and much of it doesn't require a particularly close reading of the show. It's just visible if you watch both eras back to back. In the original 3 seasons, Peter Griffin is a fool, but he is a recognizable human fool. He makes terrible decisions because he doesn't think things through, but he loves his family. He feels guilt. He makes amends. He hugs Lois after a fight and means it. He is capable of the kind of growth that even a not very bright person is capable of. The character has warmth. The post-revival Peter, the one who has been the primary version of the character for most of the show's run, is functionally a different entity. He commits acts that the original Peter would not recognize as his own. He doesn't learn from experiences that devastate him. He causes serious harm to the people around him and reacts to the consequences with something between indifference and amusement. He has become, in the vocabulary of fan discussion, Flanderized to the point of replacement. Meg's treatment, which was mild in the original run, a slightly boring and somewhat overlooked teenager, becomes systematic and extreme in the revival. The specific character of what happens to Meg in the post-revival seasons, the way the abuse escalates and becomes more graphic and more explicit, feels like a tone shift that is qualitative rather than just quantitative. The early show was not mean to Meg in the way the later show is. These are different attitudes toward the character, and the theory argues that the difference is explained by there being genuinely different shows. Stewie's evolution is the starkest example. Original Stewie is the evil genius baby, the world domination schemer, the would-be matricide. Post-revival Stewie, from around season 4 onward, becomes progressively softer, more emotionally present, more interested in his friendship with Brian than in his plans for planetary conquest. By the later seasons, the original Stewie's defining characteristic has been essentially retired. The theorist argues that this isn't character development. It's a different character wearing the same clothes. Brian's deterioration, which the previous section explored in some depth, follows the same pattern. The voice of reason becomes the voice of insufferable self-justification. The loyal friend becomes the unreliable narcissist. The failed writer with genuine longing to be taken seriously becomes the pretentious fraud who never actually produces anything worthy of the attention he demands. The parallel universe theory provides an explanation for all of these shifts that the show itself never offers. When the show was canceled and the 3-year gap occurred, everything changed. The writing staff scattered. Seth MacFarlane became involved in multiple other projects. The cultural moment shifted. The show came back as something that carried the names and visual designs of the original characters, but was operating from a fundamentally different creative set of assumptions. In the fan theory framework, this real-world discontinuity maps onto an in-universe discontinuity. The show didn't just change its creative approach. The Griffins we follow from season 4 onward are literally not the same Griffins from the first 3 seasons. They are the version of the family that exists in a different branch of reality, one where Peter's basic humanity has been replaced by something darker, one where Meg's family dynamic has shifted from neglect to active cruelty, one where Stewie's ambitions have turned inward rather than outward. Back to the pilot is the key piece of evidence because it seems to exist precisely to address this issue while ultimately not resolving it. In that episode, when Brian and Stewie use the time machine to go back to the pilot, they encounter exactly the version of the characters that early fans remember. The show acknowledges that those characters existed and were different. But the mechanics of the journey, which should by the show's own internal rules be time travel, seem to deposit them in a place that isn't quite the past. It's somewhere else. The theorist argues this is because the machine didn't go back in time. It went sideways. It went to the other universe. The one where the show was never canceled, or where it came back differently, or where the choices made in the writing room produced a different set of characters. The universe where the original Griffins still live. There's an elegance to this reading that appeals to fans who felt the show's character changes were too abrupt, too comprehensive, and too permanent to be explained by the usual excuse of long-running television drift. The shows aren't the same show. They never were the same show after the gap. And the episode that seems to point most directly at this discontinuity, the one that takes the characters back to their origin point, ends up confirming it rather than resolving it. The multiverse, we know from multiple episodes of the actual show, is real within the Family Guy universe. Road to the Multiverse is an entire episode built around Stewie and Brian traveling through alternate realities. Infinite different versions of the Griffin family exist. Different choices were made. Different timelines branched off. The theory says this is true not just within the show but for the show itself. What we call Family Guy is actually two closely related but fundamentally different programs, connected by name and by the visual continuity of the characters, but operating in separate narrative universes that happen to have started from the same point. The Griffins who came back in 2005 were not the Griffins who were canceled in 2002, they were the other ones. Section 6. Paying for Sins: The Griffins in Purgatory. Every long-running animated show seems to eventually attract some version of the everyone is dead theory. The Simpsons has several. Gravity Falls has one. There are whole essays about what the purgatory framework means for SpongeBob SquarePants. It's a narrative template that people reach for when a show's internal logic seems to resist more grounded explanations. But the purgatory theory for Family Guy is one of the more carefully constructed versions because it pays attention to a specific detail that makes it feel less like a generic everyone is dead theory and more like a genuine reading of the show's specific characters. The theory goes like this. The Griffin family, and perhaps the entire population of Quahog, are not living their lives. They are serving sentences. The town of Quahog is a kind of liminal space between one state of being and another. The characters are being held in circumstances that are specifically designed to frustrate them, to deny them the things they most want to be, as a form of moral correction for who they were in their previous lives. Look at each character through this lens, and the specificity becomes striking. Stewie Griffin is a brilliant, sophisticated intelligence imprisoned inside the body of an infant. He can speak, he can reason, he can build devices that function beyond anything current human technology is capable of. And none of it matters because he is 1 year old. He cannot walk outside without permission. He cannot eat what he wants without someone putting it in front of him. He cannot go where he wants, or stay up as late as he wants, or interact with the world on his own terms in any meaningful way. His extraordinary mind is trapped in a body that society will not allow to exercise any autonomy. If that's not a punishment, it's a very good impression of one. What might Stewie have done to deserve this? The theory suggests that in his past life, Stewie was a dictator, a genuinely evil ruler, someone who wielded enormous power over millions of people and used it badly. The version of him who ended up in Quahog is being made to experience the opposite of power, the most extreme form of impotence that exists, being a baby, being literally kept in a crib, being at the mercy of every adult who happens to walk into the room. Every scheme he constructs, every plan for domination, runs into the same wall it always does. He's 1 year old and nobody is listening. Brian Griffin is an intellectual of genuine quality. He has read widely. He thinks carefully. He has, at his best, real literary sensibility and emotional intelligence. And he is a dog. His entire existence is spent being seen as less than the humans around him, being treated as a pet by the world even when specific individuals treat him as something more, being categorized at the most fundamental level as an animal rather than as a person. Whatever social standing and recognition he craved in his past life, whatever intellectual respect he sought, he can never fully claim it in this form. He's a dog. The best he can do is live with people who have mostly stopped noticing how strange his situation is. The sin that might have earned Brian this punishment in the Purgatory reading is vanity, pride. The kind of excessive self-regard that mistakes one's own perspective for the only valid one. And his punishment is to be forever in a position where his self-regard is fundamentally undermined by the most basic fact of his existence. Lois grew up wealthy, the daughter of a powerful and socially prominent family. She married a man who is, by every conventional measure, not her equal. She is educated, cultured, capable of elegance and sophistication, and she spends her life managing a household full of chaos while that sophistication goes completely unremarked. She was, in her previous existence, perhaps someone who looked down on people who lived the way she now lives, someone who valued status and refinement above the people who couldn't provide those things. The punishment is to love, genuinely and deeply, people who will never give her the life she might have wanted. Peter is a man of enthusiastic appetites and essentially zero self-restraint. He does what he wants when he wants it, regardless of consequences, regardless of how it affects the people around him. His desires are simple: beer, television, comfort, and he pursues them with a single-mindedness that has no room for the consideration of others. In Purgatory, he is given exactly what he seems to want: a life with no real consequences, a life where nothing he does permanently damages anything, a life where the world resets and lets him do the same things again. Which sounds like a reward until you notice that it's also a prison. He gets to want what he wants and get what he wants, and then want the same things again forever, in an endless cycle that goes nowhere and means nothing. Meg in the Purgatory reading is perhaps the most interesting case, because Meg's suffering in the show seems less like a sign-specific punishment and more like a crucible. Some versions of the theory suggest she's the exception, the one character who isn't being corrected for past misdeeds but is instead being tested, refined, made stronger by being put through something very difficult and emerging intact on the other side. The fact that Meg is one of the only characters in the show who consistently demonstrates resilience, who does not break despite the accumulated weight of everything the show throws at her, supports this reading. The optimistic version of the Purgatory theory uses Stewie as its key evidence for the whole framework working as intended. Stewie, in the original seasons, is genuinely evil. Over the course of the show's run, he becomes less evil, softer, more emotionally open, more capable of kindness and sacrifice. If Purgatory is working, it should be producing exactly this kind of change, a soul being gradually corrected, the sharp edges of its worst qualities being worn smooth by circumstance. By this reading, the show's long run and the characters' gradual shifts are not the product of writing room fatigue or creative drift. They are the purgatorial process in motion. The show is about what it actually takes to change. And what it takes, apparently, is a very long time and a great deal of repetition and an enormous amount of discomfort. There's a version of the Purgatory theory that leans more explicitly toward hell rather than purgatory, and it's correspondingly darker. In the hell version, the characters are not being corrected. They are simply suffering. The punishments are their eternal states. Stewie never gets to grow up. Brian never gets to be recognized as the person he actually is. Lois never gets the life she was built for. Peter never gets to do anything that actually matters. And Meg, most cruelly of all, never gets to be loved. The evidence for this version is in the show's refusal to let improvements stick. Every time a character seems to grow, seems to learn something, seems to make real progress, the following episode returns them to their base state. If Purgatory corrects, the show doesn't show us that correction holding. If this is hell, the eternal recurrence makes perfect sense. Nothing sticks in hell. Nothing can. Which version of the theory lands harder probably depends on your own temperament, but both of them do the same thing. They take the show's most frustrating characteristic, the fact that nothing in it ever meaningfully changes, and turn it from a creative failure into a structural feature. The stasis isn't a mistake. It's the point. Section 7. The Secret Mother, Meg and Stewie's Hidden Relationship. This is one of the stranger theories in the Family Guy canon, and it requires sitting with some genuinely uncomfortable implications before you can see the logic underneath them. But the logic is there, and the show itself, possibly by accident and possibly not, has provided more than one data point that pushes it along. The theory. Meg Griffin is Stewie's biological mother. Before anything else, the surface-level evidence. In the Season 12 episode Partial Terms of Endearment, there is a throwaway moment where Lois makes a crude joke to the effect that Meg gave birth to Stewie. The joke is delivered in Lois's tone of casual dismissal, the kind of thing you say to your teenage daughter when you want to embarrass her. Meg's response to this joke is silence. She doesn't react. She doesn't deny it. She doesn't laugh it off. In a show that runs on reactions, on every character having a clear and usually exaggerated response to what's said to them, Meg's silence here is, at minimum, slightly odd. The theory builds on this by constructing a plausible backstory. Meg, who would have been around 14 or 15 when Stewie was born, had a relationship with an older boyfriend. Something happened. The pregnancy was real. And Lois, who in the show's later seasons is portrayed as more controlling and image-conscious than she appeared in the early years, made the decision to cover it up. Rather than let her teenage daughter face the consequences and complications of young parenthood, Lois took the baby as her own. The story that Stewie is Lois and Peter's youngest child is the cover story. The truth is different. Brian, who the theory notes seems to have a particular understanding of and sympathy for both Meg and Stewie that goes slightly beyond what you'd expect from a random family pet, may have been privy to the secret, may have helped maintain it. The specific closeness of Brian and Stewie, the depth of their bond throughout the show, could be at least partly explained by Brian knowing who Stewie actually is. He's protective of Meg in his way and protective of Stewie in his way, because he understands the connection between them that the rest of the family is either unaware of or actively suppressing. Lois's behavior towards Stewie in the earlier seasons, where she is warm and maternal but occasionally slightly distant in ways that the show doesn't quite explain, reads differently if she is raising a child who is not actually hers. She loves him. That much seems clear, but there's an uncertainty in her attachment in those early episodes. A quality of caring without quite fully owning the relationship, that could be the show either accidentally or deliberately reflecting something about her actual position. The extended version of the theory goes further, suggesting that the specific dynamics of the Meg-Stewie relationship in the early seasons were written with this backstory in mind, or at least that the backstory maps onto them with suspicious neatness. Stewie's first and most consuming obsession is the destruction of Lois. He wants her gone. He builds elaborate schemes to achieve her removal from his life. The theory suggests that on some unconscious level, in the logic of his infant cognition, Stewie has registered that Lois is not quite his mother, that his actual mother is somewhere else in the house, being treated badly, being diminished, being denied the very identity of having a child because the cover story requires it. And Stewie's rage at Lois is, in this reading, the rage of a child who on some deep level knows something is wrong about the person who is supposed to be his parent. Why would Peter go along with the cover? The theory is somewhat less developed on this point, though various forum discussions have offered possibilities. Peter, who loves Lois and defers to her in the major decisions, may simply have been persuaded that this was the right way to handle things. He may have been told by Lois that this was how it had to be and accepted it. His later cruelty toward Meg, which, in this reading takes on an additional layer of complexity, may carry in it some unconscious resentment of what she caused, what the pregnancy and the cover-up cost the family, even if he can't articulate that resentment clearly enough to recognize it for what it is. Meg's behavior, which in the show often veers between resigned acceptance of her treatment and periodic desperate bids for recognition and love from her family, gains a specific shape. If she gave up a child at 14 and has been living in that household ever since, watching the child she gave up grow up, knowing he is hers and unable to say so, her need to be seen and acknowledged, the most consistent and desperate note in her characterization throughout the series, becomes the need of someone whose most fundamental identity as a mother was erased before she was old enough to fully understand what had been taken from her. The episodes where Meg and Stewie interact directly, which are relatively infrequent but memorable, often carry a slightly unusual charge. They seem to like each other more than you'd expect. Stewie, who can be casually cruel to almost everyone, is not casually cruel to Meg in the same way. There are moments that almost feel protective, certainly by the later seasons when Stewie's character has softened. Whether this is intentional or coincidental is impossible to know, but the theory maps onto it all the same. The most moving version of this reading lands in the show's treatment of Meg's isolation. The most human and universal thing about Meg Griffin, the thing that makes her, as the transcript template for this video argued, arguably the most sympathetic character in the entire cast, is that she just wants to be loved. She wants her family to acknowledge that she matters. She wants to belong to something. If the theory is true, that longing has a specific source. She had the most intimate possible bond that a person can have, the bond of motherhood, and it was taken from her and hidden. She can't claim it, she can't name it, she just carries it. That's not a sitcom premise, that's a tragedy. Section 8. The actor inside the baby Stewie is not what he appears. The show within a show reading of Family Guy has multiple versions, and we'll look at the broader American Dad version in a later section. But this particular theory focuses on one specific character and makes a claim that is audacious enough to be memorable on its own terms. Stewie Griffin is not a baby. More specifically, the person playing Stewie on the show within a show is not a baby. He is an adult. A small adult, a person of short stature, who was cast to play the infant role because the people making the show thought it would be funnier that way. The theory originates primarily from a Reddit post by user Jacob Wallace, 8721, and it draws most of its evidence from Season 15, Episode 4, titled Inside Family Guy. That episode purports to give the audience a behind-the-scenes look at how the show is made, framed as a kind of documentary about the Griffins as actors playing fictionalized versions of themselves. The episode operates as a meta-commentary on the show's own existence, acknowledging that the Griffins are not simply a real family but a set of performers playing up versions of themselves for an audience. This opens the door, the theory argues, to a completely different reading of everything we think we know about Stewie. In the show-as-show framework, the character of Stewie is performed by a short adult who agreed to play a baby because the creators decided that angle would work best for the comedy they were attempting. The deep voice, the British accent, the adult vocabulary and sensibility, none of these are anomalies requiring explanation. They're the actor's actual voice and manner coming through despite the costume of infancy. The theorist even argues that Stewie may be the oldest of the Griffin children rather than the youngest. Peter and Lois, in the actors' real ages, as implied by the show, are clearly old enough to have an adult child. And the actor who plays Stewie, who is small and might read younger than his actual age, was cast in the youngest role specifically because the contrasting dynamic of a baby who sounds and acts like a sophisticated adult was the joke the show was built around. The sex jokes and relationship plots that involve Stewie, which sit somewhat uneasily in the framework of a literal one-year-old having these kinds of interests, become entirely unremarkable if the actor playing him is a grown person. Of course, he has interests in romance and attraction. He's an adult. He just happens to be playing an infant. The theory also points to a Simpsons precedent. There is a character in The Simpsons known among fans as the Estonian Dwarf, a cigarette-smoking small adult who is revealed to have been doubling for child characters like Lisa and Milhouse throughout the show. The revelation that short adults can be cast as cartoon child characters has precedent in the very genre that Family Guy belongs to. One of the theory's more charming implications is that it explains the show's relationship to its own internal time. Stewie never ages. He has been 1 year old for as long as the show has been running. In reality, the actor simply chooses to keep playing the baby role because it's the role he was hired for. The character of Stewie as Baby is a performance that the real person underneath has maintained for decades. There's a particular moment in Inside Family Guy that fans who support this theory find especially significant. During the episode's behind-the-scenes conceit, the cast is shown interacting in ways that blur the line between the characters they play and whoever they actually are. Stewie, in this framing, is shown in a way that suggests awareness of the performance. The baby knows it's a performance, because the baby is not a baby. The theory doesn't need to be literally true to do interesting things to your experience of the show. Once you've heard it, the image of Stewie in any given episode takes on a slightly different quality. You start to notice, or imagine you notice, the awareness behind the character. The sense that whoever is inside that yellow shirt and those little shorts knows exactly what they're doing and is doing it very deliberately. And Seth MacFarlane's own statements about the creation of Stewie add a small layer of additional texture here. MacFarlane has said publicly that Stewie's voice is based on Rex Harrison, the British actor who played Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. He said he came up with the idea of putting Rex Harrison's voice into a baby's body. The resulting character has always operated as a performance within a performance. An actor playing a character whose fundamental joke is that he seems to be performing a different character than the one he obviously is. The baby who speaks like a villain. The infant who sounds like an adult. The character who is visually one thing and verbally something entirely different. In the actor theory, that layering collapses. There's no performance within a performance. There's just a small man who agreed to dress as a baby and deliver lines in a British accent, and who has been doing it for decades because the audience never stopped watching. Section 9. The CIA Universe Talking Animals, Connected Shows, and a Government Conspiracy. Seth MacFarlane has created multiple animated shows. Family Guy premiered in 1999. American Dad premiered in 2005. The Cleveland Show ran from 2009 to 2013. These three shows have always existed in related universes, sharing certain characters, crossing over occasionally, existing within geographic proximity to one another. Rhode Island and Virginia aren't far apart. The shared universe is not an accident. But there's a theory that the shared universe is more deeply connected than the casual crossovers suggest, and that the connection runs through a single institutional thread, the Central Intelligence Agency. We've already discussed in the section on Brian's origin why the CIA's explanation for talking animals has more support in the MacFarlane universe than it might have in any other context. American Dad makes it canonical that the CIA performs consciousness transfer operations on animals. Klaus the goldfish is a confirmed human consciousness in an animal body, placed there by the CIA. The technology is real within this fiction. The extended theory argues that every unexplained sentient animal in the MacFarlane universe is a product of this same program. Brian, obviously. But also Ernie the giant chicken, whose intelligence and persistent focus on Peter suggests something more than animal programming. The various other anthropomorphic creatures who appear across the shows and are treated as simply strange rather than requiring explanation. In American Dad, Roger the alien is housed by the Smith family under conditions of government secrecy. His presence in their home is known to and tolerated by the CIA because he is, in some capacity, an asset. The CIA's tolerance for extreme and highly classified operations, for things that should by rights be impossible or illegal, is established throughout that show. The theorist's argument is that in a universe where the CIA routinely inserts human consciousness into animals, runs alien sheltering operations through suburban families, and maintains surveillance of essentially everyone in ways that ordinary citizens have no knowledge of, the existence of a talking dog living with a middle-class family in Rhode Island is not a random anomaly. It's a placement. Brian was put there. His presence in the Griffin household, his role as a more or less functional adult in a family that treats him as a member rather than a pet, is a consequence of an operation that nobody else in the family is aware of. The question of why the CIA would want a consciousness in a dog's body living with the Griffin family is one that different versions of the theory answer differently. The most interesting version suggests that Peter Griffin himself is more significant than he appears. Peter in this reading is not simply a random middle-class man. He is a person whose life and family and neighborhood intersect with something the CIA has an interest in monitoring. The nature of that interest has never been specified, but the ongoing presence of an asset in his household suggests it exists. The Susie Swanson angle, first proposed by Redditor T. Cromps, adds another layer to the CIA in Quahog picture. Susie is Joe and Bonnie Swanson's infant daughter, a recurring background character in the show. In several episodes, her inner thoughts are given voice by a narrator. That narrator is Patrick Stewart. Patrick Stewart also voices Avery Bullock, the CIA director who appears in American Dad, the man who is established to control a device that allows him to operate remotely as a baby avatar. The theory, Susie Swanson is one of those avatars. The baby in the Swanson household is not actually Joe and Bonnie's child. Or rather, there is a child, but the consciousness operating that child's body is Avery Bullock, the CIA director, using one of his remote avatars to maintain surveillance in Quahog, for reasons connected to whatever the agency's interest in that neighborhood has always been. The voice casting, which could be dismissed as a simple joke about Patrick Stewart's dignified delivery being incongruous in a baby's context, becomes something more deliberate in this framework. It's not just a joke. It's the show acknowledging, in the coded visual language of casting choices, that Susie is more than she appears. That the voice coming out of her is not the voice of a baby, but the voice of a powerful adult who has chosen this particular form for this particular assignment. The broader implication of the CIA universe theory is that Quahog is not a normal town. It never was. The neighborhood of Spooner Street, with its improbable collection of characters, its talking dog, its paraplegic police officer whose abilities under any objective assessment go far beyond what a wheelchair user would be capable of, its perpetual one-year-old with advanced degrees in engineering, is a location of active government interest. Something about this place, this street, this specific collection of families, matters to an organization that keeps very careful track of things that matter. Whether that interest is benign or not, whether the CIA's presence in Quahog is protective or predatory, the theory leaves carefully ambiguous. What it insists on is that the weirdness of the show's setup, the things that were never explained and never needed to be explained in a comedy context, have a structural explanation. If you look at the world these shows inhabit with sufficient attention, the McFarlane universe is not simply a collection of animated shows about strange families. It is a connected geography under constant institutional surveillance, in which the line between person and animal is more permeable than any citizen is supposed to know, and in which the government's reach extends much further into the personal lives of ordinary people than any of those people have ever been told. The Griffins don't know any of this. They have never known any of this. They go to the bar and watch television and fight with each other and get into cartoonish trouble, and none of it seems connected to anything larger. But the CIA operative across the street knows. The consciousness in the goldfish knows. The talking dog sitting in the living room, occasionally glancing towards something that nobody else sees, knows exactly what he is and why he's there. Whether he tells anyone else is a different question entirely. Section 10. The Tick, the Neighbors, and the Secrets of Spooner Street. The Neighbors are where some of the show's most interesting secondary fan theories live, because the Neighbors are where the show is most consistent in leaving things unexplained. Joe Swanson, Glenn Quagmire, Cleveland Brown, for most of the show's run. These are Peter Griffin's closest friends, the men he drinks with at the Drunken Clam, the people who make up his immediate world outside the family. And all three of them carry mysteries that the show has dangled without ever fully resolving. Joe Swanson's is the most explicit. From the very first episode in which he appears, Season 1's A Hero Sits Next Door, Joe is established as a man who is remarkable even by the show's generous standards. He moved into the neighborhood and immediately became the most admired person on the block. He was a police officer, but more than that, he was a figure of genuine heroism, the kind of man whose history of bravery and physical achievement is so extensive that Peter Griffin, who is not typically prone to admiring other men, finds himself genuinely jealous of Joe's presence. Joe is paralyzed from the waist down. The show establishes this immediately, and the show also establishes, somewhat contradictorily, that Joe is one of the most physically formidable people in Quahog. He swings himself across the floor with his arms to fight. He lifts himself over obstacles that would stop most able-bodied adults. He has, in various episodes, defeated multiple attackers simultaneously, survived situations that would have killed people who had full use of their legs, and generally operated with a physical competence that doesn't entirely fit the physical limitations he supposedly has. The fan theory, proposed by Reddit user Mr. D's 444, is one of the more playful entries in the Family Guy theory catalog. Joe Swanson is, or was, The Tick. The Tick was a superhero comedy that aired on Fox from 2001 to 2002, meaning it existed in the same network space as Family Guy during part of the show's original run. The Tick was played by Patrick Warburton. Joe Swanson is voiced by Patrick Warburton. Both characters share a very specific physical template. Enormous, square-jawed, with a deep, deadpan voice that somehow makes every absurd thing they say sound completely earnest. Both have a slightly theatrical quality to their heroism, a tendency toward dramatic declarations about justice and duty. In the theory, Joe's history before Quahog includes a period as The Tick. The superhero identity was one he took on when he felt that conventional law enforcement wasn't enough to address the level of threat he was equipped to handle. The costume, in this reading, may actually have functional properties, possibly the source of some of the enhanced physical ability that Joe demonstrates even without full use of his lower body. His paralysis, which the show has given two separate and contradictory explanations for over the years, a fall from a roof while fighting a fictional version of the Grinch, and a gunshot wound from a drug operation gone wrong, may be a consequence of one of his Tick-era adventures that he can't discuss publicly. The classified nature of some of his heroic history would explain why his official story changed. The theory is deliberately lighter in tone than most of what we've explored tonight. It's a fun piece of cross-show speculation rather than a deep structural argument. But it represents something genuine about the way Family Guy's fan community engages with the show. A recognition that the show's world is densely populated with people who all have their own histories, their own secrets, their own explanations for being the specific and somewhat improbable people they are. Quagmire's history is darker, and the fan theories around him reflect that. The show has always strongly implied that Glenn Quagmire's sexual history is expansive beyond any normal human capability, and sometimes extends into genuinely troubling territory. The show plays his behavior for comedy, sometimes with evident discomfort, sometimes with surprising directness about the things being implied. The fan theories around Quagmire's background tend to focus on the period before he settled in Quahog. He has been established in the show as a former Navy pilot, and the Navy connection has generated a theory that his particular relationship with women, both his compulsive pursuit of them and his apparent ability to attract them in numbers that defy credibility, is connected to something that happened during his military service. Some versions suggest trauma, others suggest conditioning. The most interesting version suggests that Quagmire was involved in classified operations during his military career, the kind that don't appear on any official record, and that his behavior in civilian life is in some way a consequence of who he had to be in that context. The Quagmire as former government asset theory connects loosely to the broader CIA universe framework, particularly given the show's established relationship between Quahog and American Dad's CIA world. If the neighborhood is under surveillance, non-Fempple residents have histories with government institutions, it would make sense that the sexually aggressive airline pilot with a murky past and an implausibly successful life is also more than he appears. Cleveland's departure, which was addressed earlier in the context of the Peter's broken mind theory, can also be read through the neighbor secrets lens. Cleveland was, for several seasons, one of the 4 primary members of the Drunken Clam group. He left Quahog for a spin-off show, moved to a different state, remarried. The circumstances of his departure from the group and the way his character changed in the Cleveland show compared to his earlier Family Guy personality have generated their own small cluster of theories about why he needed to leave and what he may have been running from. The most mundane version is simply that the spin-off necessitated changes and the writers didn't worry too much about continuity. The more interesting version is that Cleveland, who was perhaps the most grounded and quietly perceptive of the 4 friends, saw something in Peter's deterioration that frightened him. He recognized that whatever was happening to his friend was real and serious, and he made the pragmatic decision to remove himself from proximity to it. His spin-off life in Stoolbend, Virginia, is not an escape from Quahog. It's a kind of protective distance. One of the show's most extended and unresolved neighbor mysteries involves the relationship between Peter's group and the various one-time or minor characters who populate Quahog's wider social world. The show has, over the years, introduced and then quietly forgotten an extraordinary number of supporting figures. People who appeared to be recurring characters and then simply vanished. Storylines that were started and never finished. Relationships that were established and then ignored. In the universe as CIA Project Reading, these disappearances are not continuity failures. They are reassignments. People who were placed in proximity to the Griffin household for observational purposes and then removed when their assignment ended. The rotating cast of minor characters, the ones who appear for a season and then are never seen again, are not writing room oversights. They are the visible surface of an operation that has been running since before the show began. The neighborhood of Spooner Street is a controlled environment. The people who live on it are not all there by accident. The show gives you just enough of a glimpse of this to let the theory feel possible, and not quite enough detail to let you be certain either way. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what a controlled environment would do. Section 11. Peter Griffin's Hive Mind. The Multiverse of One Man. By this point in our journey through the fan theories, we've established that the Family Guy universe is far stranger and more internally complicated than the show's surface presentation suggests. We've visited Peter's shattered mind and Stewie's infant perception and Brian's hidden human origin. We've sat in the purgatory that might hold the Griffins and walked the halls of the CIA operation that might connect the McFarlane shows. We've thought about parallel universes and show within shows and cover stories that stretch across seasons. There is one more theory about the nature of Peter Griffin specifically that deserves its own extended consideration because it deals with the show's most persistently baffling structural feature. The way that Peter seems to have memories of events that couldn't possibly have happened within a single continuous timeline. The show's relationship with its own continuity has always been loose. Characters reference things that happened in past episodes but also reference things that seem to contradict past episodes. Peter has, across the show's run, had vastly different backgrounds, different family histories, different sets of experiences that couldn't all belong to the same person. He was apparently raised by his mother and his father Francis and his biological father Thelonious Griffin, and has various siblings and backstories that don't entirely line up. He has had experiences across virtually every conceivable cultural and professional context, shown in flashbacks, that would require several lifetimes to accumulate. The fan theory proposed by Reddit user FazePoopy2 is that Peter Griffin possesses a hive mind. Specifically, that Peter is connected to every version of himself across every parallel universe, and that he experiences the memories and lives of all those other Peters simultaneously. The theory draws an explicit comparison to the logic of Rick and Morty, another animated show that deals with multiverse theory, where the central characters are aware of and have access to their alternate selves. In Peter's case, the awareness is not necessarily conscious. He doesn't know he's a hive mind in the way that Rick knows he's a multiverse traveler, but his brain, or whatever the equivalent is in his case, receives memories and impressions from thousands of parallel Peters, and those experiences surface as what appear to be flashback memories in the show. The cutaway gags in which Peter references things that happened to him, which often bear no relationship to anything established in the show's actual continuity, are not inconsistencies. They are transmissions from other timelines. Genuine memories of things that happened to different versions of Peter in different branches of reality. This explains several things. The show's notorious inability to maintain consistent character history. The way Peter seems to have been everywhere and done everything without any of it particularly affecting who he is in the present. The way that references to his past never quite add up into a coherent biography. He doesn't have a biography in the traditional sense. He has access to thousands of biographies. Which one surfaces in any given episode depends on which transmission is strongest that week. The theory also offers something interesting on the question of why Peter never seems to learn from his mistakes in any lasting way. If his experience is the composite of thousands of lives rather than one life, there is no single lesson that sticks across all of them. Some version of Peter learned the lesson, other versions didn't. The version sitting in the drunken clam right now is drawing on a library of experience so vast that any individual lesson is diluted into near invisibility by the weight of all the other memories pressing against it. The multiverse of Peter also explains the physical durability. Different versions of Peter have different levels of invulnerability, different resistances to damage. The version we follow in any given episode is, by the luck of which transmission is dominant, sometimes more resilient than a human being should be. The injuries that would kill a person in a world of fixed physical laws are survivable in a reality where the physics are slightly different depending on which thread of the hive is most present. The Stewie connection adds one more dimension. The theory's extended version suggests that Stewie may have inherited some version of this hive mind quality. His intelligence, his ability to build devices that his infant body should not be able to construct, his seemingly intuitive grasp of physics and engineering and temporal mechanics, all of these might be the product not of his own genius, but of his connection to the broader grid of Stewie consciousnesses across the multiverse. He draws on the knowledge of 1,000 parallel versions of himself. The time machine isn't the invention of one baby. It's the product of a distributed intelligence that spans universes, condensed into the body of a 1-year-old in Rhode Island. This gives Stewie and Peter something in common that the show never makes explicit. Both of them are, in some sense, more than themselves. Both of them carry within them access to something larger than their individual lives. In Peter's case, it's a connection he doesn't fully register. In Stewie's case, it's a resource he uses constantly without understanding its source. The hive mind theory is one of the more technically elegant entries in the Family Guy theory canon because it solves multiple problems with a single mechanism. The continuity problems, the durability, the way Peter knows things he shouldn't know and has done things he couldn't have done, the way Stewie's capabilities exceed what any individual brain could produce. None of these require separate explanations. They all reduce to the same cause. The multiverse is real in this universe. We know that from Road to the Multiverse. The hive mind theory says that Peter has been aware of it all along. Not intellectually aware, not consciously navigating it, but structurally connected to it. He's the center of a web that stretches further than anyone in Quahog can see. Every version of him that has ever existed in any parallel universe is, in some infinitesimal way, present in the man watching television on that couch. No wonder he seems like he's been everywhere. He has, just not all in the same lifetime. Section 12. What the theories tell us, stories within stories. We have spent a long time in Quahog tonight. We've walked through the nightmare version of it, the one where Peter is alone in a hospital room and the whole comedy is a grief dream. We've seen it through the eyes of a very young child, enormous and confusing and full of people who are too complex to fully understand. We've looked at what the dog actually is and where he came from and why nothing in his nature makes sense unless you expand the frame. We've visited the other universe, the one where the original characters still live, the one that the time machine might have reached by going sideways instead of back. We've sat in the purgatory and felt the specific ways that each character's suffering is calibrated to the particular thing they most need to be corrected for. And then there are the lighter theories. The Joe Swanson in a superhero costume, the CIA director living as a baby across the street, the hive mind that connects every Peter who has ever existed across an infinity of realities. Those ones carry their own particular pleasure, the pleasure of a creative mind finding unexpected connections, of seeing the Easter egg hidden in the visual language of the show. Fan theories, as a form, tell us something important about how people relate to stories. The theories that get shared and discussed and built upon over years are rarely the ones that catch a small continuity error and declare the show internally inconsistent. Those are interesting puzzles, but they don't spread the way these larger, more structurally ambitious theories do. The ones that spread are the ones that find a way to make the show mean something different. The ones that look at the surface of the comedy and see a tragedy underneath it. The ones that take the show's most uncomfortable elements, the cruelty and the chaos and the refusal of consequences, and find a reading that makes those elements coherent rather than accidental. The Peter's broken mind theory went viral in 2022 because it did something that the best fan theories do. It took the thing about the show that had always felt slightly wrong and gave it a reason. Why is Meg treated so badly? Why does Peter never grow or change? Why does nothing ever stick? The theory answers all of those questions with a single devastating premise. It turns the show's flaws into features. It turns the cruelty into grief. It turns the stasis into the psychology of a man who cannot afford for anything to change. The Stewie-as perception theory does something equally interesting, but kinder. It takes the show's strangest and most unexplained element, the fact that a baby builds nuclear devices and nobody notices, and reveals it as essentially sweet. A very smart child is working out what the world is. The weapons are toys, the schemes are play. The arch-villainy is what ambition and intelligence look like before they've been given any context to operate in. Both of these theories are, at their core, about the same thing. The gap between how something looks from the outside and what it means from the inside. Peter from the outside looks like a careless man doing careless things in a consequence-free universe. From the inside of the theory, he's a man who has already experienced the worst possible consequences and is using this imagined world as the only way he knows to survive them. Stewie from the outside looks like a cartoon villain, a baby doing adult things for comic effect. From the inside of the theory, he's just a baby, doing what babies do, which is to try with immense and earnest seriousness to understand a world that is far too large and complicated for him. The theories about the CIA and the parallel universes and the hive mind are doing something a bit different. They're not trying to find the emotional truth underneath the comedy. They're trying to build a unified theory of the universe the show inhabits. They're asking, if all of the rules that seem to operate in this world were real rules, what would the world actually be? What kind of place is Quahog, really? What does its geography imply about the people who live there? What does the existence of a talking dog tell you about who controls the information in this reality? These theories are essentially world-building exercises. They take the show's internal logic and extend it outward, building the structure that would have to exist behind the visible surface for the visible surface to make sense. They're less interested in what the story means emotionally and more interested in what it implies structurally. They're the work of people who have watched the show so many times and thought about it so carefully that they've started to see the load-bearing walls inside the architecture. All of these theories are, in the end, a form of love. Not an uncritical love, and not always a comfortable love. The Peter's broken mind theory is built partly on the recognition that the show has things wrong with it, things that feel off, things that don't quite fit the cheerful comedy premise. The theorist who built it was looking at those wrong notes and trying to find what they were actually saying. That's what attentive readers do with things they care about. Family Guy has been imperfect from the beginning and has become more imperfect over time by almost any measure that you could apply. The ratings have fallen, the characters have changed in ways that not everyone welcomed, the original writing staff scattered. Seth MacFarlane moved on to other projects. The show continued past the point where any single creative vision was strong enough to hold it in a consistent shape. And yet here we are, 2.5 decades later, sitting with the theories, still thinking about Peter Griffin and what he might really be, still wondering what Stewie was trying to tell us, still turning Brian over in our hands, looking at the place where the seam between human and animal doesn't quite close cleanly. The show gave us characters who got under our skin in ways that even the people making it probably didn't fully anticipate. And when characters get under your skin, you start asking questions about them that the show was never designed to answer. You start building the answers yourself. You start looking at the dog with the martini glass and thinking, what if there's more here than a joke? There almost always is. The best theories don't disprove the joke, they deepen it. They find the architecture that the joke was always standing on, even when the people who told the joke didn't know the architecture was there. Tonight, we've walked through a version of Quahog that is weirder and darker and more complicated than the one the show officially presents. We've visited purgatory and a broken man's dream, and a baby's filtered perception of an overwhelming world. We've met a CIA operation that has been running in plain sight for decades, and a hive mind that connects every possible version of a man who always seemed to have too much history for any single lifetime. What you do with these theories is up to you. You can take them seriously as genuine readings of the show's underlying logic. You can enjoy them as elaborate games, the kind of creative speculation that happens when intelligent people care a great deal about something that doesn't require them to care at all. You can file them away as interesting possibilities that change the texture of the show slightly without making any definitive claims about truth. But the next time you watch Family Guy, and if you're the kind of person who watches at 2 in the morning with the lights off while the night settles in around you, you probably will watch it again. Pay attention to the small things. The moments where Meg's family looks at her. The way Brian's eyes sometimes carry something that a dog's eyes don't usually carry. The quality of Peter's laughter when something happens that should have hurt him. Look at the lights in the windows of those houses on Spooner Street. Think about who is watching from across the street. Think about what the baby in the nursery is building in the dark. There are stories inside this story. There have always been stories inside this story. The people who found them were paying attention. The lights of Quahog are still on. The town is still there, in whatever form it actually exists. And somewhere in it, the dream continues. Rest well. If this video found you somewhere dark and quiet and helped make the night feel less empty, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. And leave a comment below, your favorite theory from tonight, the one that landed hardest, the one that changed something about how you see the show. We read every single one. Thank you for being here. Appendix. The minor theories, smaller threads in the Quahog tapestry. No survey of Family Guy fan theories would be complete without a section devoted to the smaller, more specific theories that don't rise to the level of restructuring the entire show, but are nonetheless fascinating for what they say about particular characters, moments, or relationships. These are the theories that fans propose and debate in comment sections, that get posted and upvoted and discussed, and then sometimes forgotten until someone brings them back up again. They are the minor threads in a very large and very dense piece of narrative fabric. The Calvin Klein theory and Peter's impossible finances. One of the persistent background mysteries of Family Guy is Peter Griffin's apparent ability to fund his lifestyle. He works at a brewery, first the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Company, and before that, a toy factory. Neither of these is the kind of job that would traditionally support the level of expense that Peter's various adventures and home modifications seem to require. He owns vehicles. He makes significant alterations to his house. He finances enterprises and schemes that should realistically bankrupt a working-class family within a couple of episodes. Fans have noticed this, and a Reddit user responding to a Watch Mojo compilation proposed an explanation that is quietly elegant. In Season 2, there is an episode in which Stewie is featured in a Calvin Klein advertisement. Stewie is a baby who, in the appropriate circumstances, can pass as simply a cute and photogenic infant. The theory proposes that Stewie's modeling career, which the show acknowledges in that episode, has been substantially more extensive than what we've seen. The money Stewie has earned from modeling for major brands has been flowing into the household's general finances, funding Peter's seemingly impossible purchases. Peter, who doesn't look too carefully at where money comes from as long as it's there, has been bankrolled by his infant son's side career in baby product advertising. It's a minor theory, essentially a jokey explanation for a continuity problem that the show itself was never interested in addressing. But the specific evidence it cites, the actual Calvin Klein episode, and the way it requires no real stretch of the show's internal logic to work, give it a satisfying quality. Cleveland Jr. is Peter's son. This theory has circulated persistently since Cleveland Jr.'s character design was substantially changed for the Cleveland show. In Family Guy, Cleveland Jr. appeared occasionally as a slim, quiet, relatively unremarkable child. In the Cleveland show, he was redesigned as a larger, more physically imposing boy, with features that, when laid next to Peter Griffin's features, invite comparison. The specific comparison that fans make, Cleveland Jr.'s new facial structure, particularly his chin and his hair, mirrors Peter Griffin's facial structure more closely than it mirrors Cleveland's. And in the years covered by the timeline of the shows, there were extended periods during which Cleveland was living apart from his first wife, Loretta, while Peter and Cleveland were close friends. The theory suggests that one of those periods produced an encounter between Peter and Loretta, the consequences of which became Cleveland Jr. Cleveland's eventual departure from Quahog, in this reading, carries an additional layer of weight. He knows. He's always suspected, or always known, and the accumulated discomfort of living in close proximity to the man while raising a child that might be that man's biological son eventually becomes too much. He leaves. He starts a new life in Stoolbend with a son he loves who carries a secret that he has chosen, for everyone's sake, not to examine too closely. The Seth MacFarlane self-insert theory. A theory that works somewhat differently from the structural ones, because it operates not on the fictional level of the show's internal logic, but on the meta level of who made the show and why. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's main characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. Alex Borstein voices Lois, along with several other female characters. The theory, proposed with varying degrees of seriousness across multiple fan communities, is that the show's relationship network is, among other things, a map of MacFarlane's real feelings toward his collaborator. The evidence is circumstantial but notable. Every character voiced by MacFarlane, Peter, Brian, Quagmire, and to a lesser extent Stewie, has at some point expressed significant attraction to or feelings for Lois. This is partly a structural feature of the show. Lois is the central female character, so of course various male characters orbit her. But the consistency of it, the way that the show keeps returning to the idea of these characters being drawn to her, and the fact that they are all specifically voiced by the same person, invites a certain kind of reading. MacFarlane himself has never publicly confirmed anything like this, and fan theories that project real emotional states onto creators based on what happens in their fictional work are a notoriously unreliable form of speculation. People make art for complicated reasons that rarely reduce to simple biography. But the theory has a life in the fan community precisely because it reframes something that was always slightly odd about the show's dynamics. The way every MacFarlane-voiced character ends up, at some point, in the emotional vicinity of Lois. The Steve Smith connection. Originating from a now-deleted Reddit post, this theory argues that Steve Smith, the teenage son in American Dad, is actually one of the Griffin family's lost children. The argument rests primarily on the observation that Steve looks more like the Quahog residents than he looks like the Smiths. His chin and his hair have more in common with Peter Griffin's facial structure than they do with Stan Smith's, while his nose has been noted to resemble Lois's. In a universe where the two shows explicitly share reality, and where the CIA is established to have interests in both families' neighborhoods, a child who was moved from one family to the other during infancy is not an impossible premise. The Griffins have a precedent for children who don't quite match the expected genetic profile. The Smiths have the kind of resources and connections, through Stan's CIA employment, to have arranged such a transfer if the circumstances required it. What those circumstances might have been, the theory doesn't fully specify. But the visual evidence and the shared universe have been enough to keep this one circulating for years. Mayor Adam West was always pretending. Mayor Adam West, who appeared throughout Family Guy's run as the eccentric and apparently non-rational mayor of Quahog, was widely interpreted by viewers as simply a comedy character whose jokes operated on the premise of his complete detachment from reality. He did and said things that didn't make sense. He responded to reasonable questions with non sequiturs. He seemed to inhabit a slightly different version of the world than the other characters around him. The theory, referenced in Watch Mojo's 30 Theory compilation, is that this was always an act. Mayor Adam West was, in this reading, a highly intelligent political operator who had learned very early in his career that the most effective way to avoid accountability, to deflect scrutiny, and to maintain power in a town that was chronically unable to hold its leaders responsible for anything was to appear to be not fully in contact with consensus reality. If you seem confused, you can't be blamed for a decision. If you seem to be operating on a different logical framework than everyone else, your statements can't be used as evidence of intent. If every conversation you have ends with the other person more baffled than when it started, you can never quite be cornered. Mayor West in this reading is one of the shrewdest characters in the entire show. He has been playing a character, the eccentric mayor, while the real person underneath runs the city with perfect, self-interested clarity. His apparent randomness is actually a very sophisticated political performance. The evidence for this is the kind that's deliberately impossible to verify, which is appropriate, because if the theory is true, Adam West would have made sure the evidence was impossible to verify. That's the whole point. The reset button as meta-commentary. This is less a fan theory about the show's world and more a theory about the show's relationship with its own audience. But it belongs in any comprehensive survey because it frames something that nearly every long-term viewer has noticed. Family Guy's characters don't grow. Events that should change them, that in any realistically continuous story would change them, are forgotten or reversed by the following episode. Brian died and came back. Stewie's evil is retired and occasionally temporarily restored. Peter's worst behavior is acknowledged in one episode and forgotten in the next. The show has a reset button that gets pressed at regular intervals. The theory is that this is intentional self-awareness. The show knows it has a reset button. The characters, who in the show's later seasons increasingly break the fourth wall, know they have a reset button. And the Conway Twitty gags, the extended jokes where the show plays an entire country song instead of doing comedy, the moments where the camera lingers on a joke long past the point of any conceivable laugh, are the show demonstrating to its audience that it knows exactly what it's doing and has chosen to keep doing it. The alternative interpretation of the reset button, the one that doesn't require self-awareness, is that the show simply doesn't care about continuity. The meta theory demands more credit for the people making the show. They care about it, they know it's there, and the fourth wall breaks are their way of nodding to the audience that this is a choice rather than an oversight. Whether that makes the reset button better or worse probably depends on whether you find self-aware laziness more or less acceptable than simply being lazy. But it's a reading that at least gives the show's worst habit something interesting to say. The Big Bang Theory, Stewie, and the Origin of Everything. One of the most cosmically ambitious theories in the Family Guy canon comes from an actual episode of the show rather than external fan speculation. But the episode's implications are so rarely discussed that it functions practically as a fan theory. In the Season 9 episode called The Big Bang Theory, it is revealed through a time travel plot that Stewie Griffin is personally responsible for the creation of the universe. His ancestor is Leonardo da Vinci, which is established in the episode, and through a sequence of events involving Stewie's time machine and his nemesis Bertram attempting to kill Leonardo da Vinci before he can reproduce, thereby eliminating Stewie from the timeline, Stewie ends up being the first matter in the Big Bang. Everything that exists in the universe came from Stewie. The show treats this as a single episode plot and then moves on. It never returns to the implications of what it established. But the fan theory around this episode argues that those implications are enormous and have been ignored at the cost of the show's internal coherence. If Stewie is literally the source of all matter in the universe, then he is not simply a character in the story. He is the substrate that the story runs on. Every atom of every character, every atom of the planet and the solar system and the galaxy began as Stewie. The show is, in this reading, a story that Stewie is telling to himself, using matter that is made of him, in a universe that would not exist without him. This is the most extreme version of the Stewie as center of everything framework. It encompasses the infant perception theory and the hive mind theories, and the purgatory theory and arguably all of the others. If Stewie is the universe, then every theory about every other character is also at the most fundamental level a theory about Stewie, because everything they're made of is him. It's possible that this level of cosmological implication was not what the writers of the Big Bang Theory episode intended when they wrote it. It's almost certain that they weren't building toward a grand, unified theory of the show's metaphysics. They were probably just doing a funny time travel episode and using the Big Bang as a punchline. But the theory community noticed what they wrote, and the theory community has been thinking about it ever since. What are the theories for? All of these theories, from the darkest to the most playful, from the cosmically ambitious to the quietly intimate, are doing the same thing at some level. They are pushing back against the idea that Family Guy is only what it appears to be. The surface of the show is frequently very loud. It makes itself hard to look at closely by filling every available space with noise and movement and cutaway jokes and characters who seem to want nothing more than your attention right now, not your sustained consideration, not your careful analysis, not your willingness to sit with something quietly and let it mean more than it seems to mean. The theories resist that loudness. They insist on finding the still point in the middle of the noise. They notice things that were not meant to be noticed, or things that were meant to be noticed by someone who was paying a specific kind of attention. They ask the show what it's really about, and they build answers in the space where the show itself hasn't answered. The fact that Family Guy has generated this level of theoretical engagement says something interesting. Shows that don't get under people's skin don't attract elaborate fan theories. You don't build cosmological readings around something you don't care about. You don't construct grief narratives around characters who never meant anything to you. The theories are a measure of how much this show, for all its flaws and all its inconsistencies and all its difficult moments, got into people's heads and stayed there. It created characters who felt real enough to ask questions about. It built a world that felt rich enough to explore beyond the edges of what was shown. It produced a mythology, entirely by accident and entirely through the accumulated weight of 2.5 decades of episodes that has given its audience enough to work with. And the work the audience has done with it, the Peter in the hospital room and the baby perceiving the world and the dog who used to be a person and the parallel universe where the original family still lives, that work is its own kind of creation. It's the show making more of itself than it was. It's the audience returning something to what gave them something. Quahog doesn't exist on any map, but people live there. They've been living there for decades. And the things they've found in the corners of that town, the things that the cameras didn't quite catch and the scripts didn't quite explain, those things have their own kind of reality now. The lights are still on. The bar is still open. The dream goes on. Thank you for falling asleep with us tonight. If the theories kept you company in the quiet hours, if they gave you something interesting to think about as your eyes got heavy and the night settled in, that was exactly what they were meant to do. Hit subscribe so you never miss a video. Leave a comment with your favorite theory, the one that changed something, the one you're still thinking about. Sweet dreams, and we'll see you in the next one. Section 13. The Chicken Wars Ernie and the Mystery That Never Ended. Of all the recurring mysteries in Family Guy's 25-year run, none is more deliberately unexplained, more persistently teased, and more consistently celebrated by the fan community than the ongoing feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken. These are the sequences that stop episodes entirely, that abandon whatever narrative was in progress, to show two figures of roughly comparable size destroying city blocks, crashing through walls, falling from skyscrapers, and engaging in combat that would be fatal many times over if the rules of the show's world were the rules of the real one. The first encounter came in Season 2, in the episode Da Boom, where a giant chicken handed Peter a coupon that had expired. Peter's reaction to the expired coupon was immediate and extreme: a fight. That fight ended with Peter apparently victorious, the chicken apparently dead, and the episode continuing as though an enormous, psychically significant battle had just occurred in the background of the main plot. Then the chicken came back, and the fight happened again, and again. Each subsequent iteration was longer, more elaborate, more destructive, and more completely devoid of any narrative justification that the show bothered to offer. The fights are deliberately funny precisely because of this lack of justification. The comedy is not in the choreography, though the choreography is elaborate and clearly produced with care. The comedy is in the contrast between the epic scale of these confrontations and the absolute absence of any explanation for why they keep happening. An expired coupon started this. And decades later, the two of them are still fighting, and nobody has ever asked why, and nobody has ever explained anything. Into that void, the fan theories have rushed. The CIA experiment framework, which we explored in the section on Brian's origin, offers the most structurally consistent explanation for Ernie. He is, like Brian, a consciousness that was placed in an animal body. But where Brian's transfer appears to have been relatively successful, producing a consciousness that retained coherent personality, memory, and functional intelligence, Ernie's transfer was less clean. The procedure that produced him was more traumatic, or the consciousness that was placed in the chicken's body was less adaptable, or something in the transfer process fragmented or degraded the memories in ways that Brian's didn't. What resulted is a consciousness that has human-level aggression and determination, and the capacity for sustained, goal-directed behavior, but that has lost access to the specific memories that would explain what it's doing. Ernie knows he has a grievance with Peter. He doesn't remember what it is. He just keeps showing up to pursue it with the focused and inexplicable intensity of someone who has forgotten everything except the direction of the anger. The fight from Peter's side is equally unexplained, and the explanation offered for his behavior is simply that he is Peter Griffin, which in the show's logic counts as a sufficient reason for almost anything. But the CIA theory extends to Peter too, in its most elaborate version. If Quahog is a site of institutional interest, if the neighborhood is populated with people whose histories are more significant than they appear, then Peter's specific and violent reaction to this particular animal, a reaction that goes far beyond what any normal person would produce in response to a stranger who gave them an expired coupon, might be the surfacing of something that has been buried rather than a spontaneous escalation. In the hive mind framework, which proposes that Peter is connected to the memories of thousands of parallel selves, a plausible version emerges in which the anger Peter feels toward the chicken is the accumulated anger of every version of Peter who has ever encountered every version of Ernie in every branch of the multiverse. Each time they fight in this universe, they are also, in some diffuse and difficult-to-articulate sense, settling scores from universes where the fight went differently. The eternal recurrence of the confrontation is not narrative laziness. It is the multiverse's unfinished business pressing through into this particular reality. The version of the theory that fans discuss most often is simpler and perhaps more satisfying for its simplicity. The chicken and Peter knew each other before Quahog. Whatever they were to each other in a previous context, whatever happened between them that created a grievance on one side and a counter-grievance on the other, the expired coupon was not the cause but the trigger. The cause predates the show. The cause may predate any specific memory that either of them has clear access to, but it is there. It has always been there. And every time they see each other's faces, it comes rushing back in the form of the only vocabulary available to either of them for the specific thing they feel. The ending of the fights is also worth noting. They never end conclusively. One party is usually left in a condition that would, in a realistic context, be lethal, and then they are apparently fine by the next time they appear. This has been cited as evidence for the show's general consequence-free reality, and in the theoretical frameworks we have examined, it is consistent with all of them. Peter's grief dream, where nothing can be permanently lost. The purgatorial space, where damage heals because the sentence requires continued operation. The parallel universe, where the physics of consequence are different from what the audience's world demands. The chicken fights are the show in miniature. They are enormous and without explanation, and strangely moving in their persistence, the way that any long-running unresolved conflict is moving, once you've observed it for long enough to understand that neither party can quite let it go. They don't end because they can't end. Because ending would require resolution, and resolution would require knowing what started it. And what started it is the thing that neither Peter nor Ernie, in this particular universe, in this particular lifetime, has been given access to. The theories help. They don't answer the question definitively. Nothing will. But they give the fight a context, a shape, a history that reaches back further than the expired coupon and extends to wherever it was that these two first found each other. In some other life or some other universe, or some program of experimentation that produced two consciousnesses who recognize something in each other that they have never been able to put down. Section 14. Lois and the Pewter-Schmidt Legacy. The Secrets of the Wealthy Wife. There is a whole category of Family Guy fan theories that focuses not on the main family's supernatural or psychological strangeness, but on the mundane-seeming but actually quite loaded background of Lois Griffin Ney. Pewterschmidt. Lois came from money. Old money. The kind that comes with a specific set of expectations about who one marries and how one lives, and what it means to be a Pewterschmidt in the social world of New England. Her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, who appears throughout the show as a recurring antagonist, despises Peter. This is played for comedy, the snobbish, wealthy father-in-law looking down on the working-class son-in-law, but it generates its own cluster of theories about what Lois's marriage to Peter actually means and what she chose when she chose it. The most interesting Lois theory, which doesn't require any cosmological framework to be plausible, argues that Lois's marriage to Peter was not the romantic rebellion it appears to be on the surface. It was a deliberate strategic choice by a woman who understood her family's world very well and decided, with full awareness of what she was doing, to exit it. The Pewterschmidt world is a world of controlled surfaces and hidden cruelties, and the specific violence of wealth that doesn't announce itself as violence. Carter Pewterschmidt is a man who has spent his entire life treating people as instruments of his interests and his comfort. Lois grew up watching that, understanding it, being shaped by it. Her choice of Peter, the most obviously wrong choice she could have made by the metrics of her origin world, was a rejection of everything that world valued. In this reading, Lois is not the patient wife of a foolish man. She is the woman who chose the fool deliberately because the fool is the opposite of everything she needed to escape. Peter's impulsiveness is the opposite of Carter's cold calculation. Peter's transparency is the opposite of the layers of performance and management that characterize her family. Peter's inability to sustain a grudge longer than about 48 hours is the opposite of the Pewterschmidt capacity for structured, long-term retribution. She chose him because he was the clearest possible distance from where she came from. The theory's extension into the show's later seasons addresses the question of why Lois becomes progressively harsher and less sympathetic as the series goes on. The reading it offers is that the choice, for all its sincerity, was not sufficient to fully escape the Pewterschmidt formation. The patterns she absorbed growing up, the tendency to manage and control, the willingness to make decisions about other people's lives without consulting them, the use of withholding as a tool for maintaining power, these are not characteristics that get eliminated simply by choosing to live differently. They are embedded. And over 20-plus years of a difficult marriage and a chaotic household, and the accumulating stress of raising children in conditions that are not the conditions she was built for, the formation that she tried to escape has been reasserting itself. The Lois who is cruel to Meg in the later seasons is not a different person from the Lois who chose Peter in defiance of her family. She is the same person, struggling with the same inheritance, sometimes winning and sometimes not. The Purgatory reading places her in a situation designed to correct something specific in her character. The Secret Mother theory places her in a situation in which she made a controlling decision about her daughter's life that has permanent consequences. Both of these readings track onto the Pewterschmidt legacy theory, because the pattern in both cases is the same: a woman using her power to manage a situation on behalf of someone who didn't ask her to. The love is real. The control is also real. The two things coexist in Lois throughout the show, and the theories that take her seriously as a character, rather than as background support for Peter's stories, are the ones that acknowledge both. Section 15. The town itself. What Quahog knows. Every story is a place as much as it is a plot or a character, and the place in Family Guy, the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, has its own minor cluster of theories that deserve attention before we bring the evening to its close. Quahog is modeled in a general way on Providence, Rhode Island, which is where Seth MacFarlane went to school and which provided the geographical and cultural backdrop for the show's setting. The show's relationship with Rhode Island is affectionate and teasing simultaneously, treating it as both a real and specific place and as a canvas on which impossible things happen with more than average frequency. The school, James Woods Regional High School, is named after the actor James Woods, who has appeared in the show as a recurring character. The brewery where Peter works is the Pawtucket Patriot Ale Company, a fictional institution in a real geographical area. The texture of the world is Rhode Island, but the events that occur within it are the events of a place where the normal rules have always been slightly negotiable. The theory that Quahog is built on a convergence point, a location where the barriers between realities are thinner than elsewhere, is one way of organizing the show's many supernatural and physically impossible events into a coherent framework. If the town's geography makes certain kinds of strange events more likely, Then the concentration of talking animals and time travel, and alien encounters and demonic visitations, and the various other improbable occurrences that Quahog has accumulated over its fictional history is not an authorial convenience, but a feature of the location. Things happen in Quahog because Quahog is the kind of place where things happen, for reasons that the town's residents have long since stopped examining. The residents are themselves a theory generator. The population of Quahog, the recurring characters beyond the main cast, is collectively one of the stranger assemblages in animated television. A mayor who appeared to be operating on a completely different logical framework from everyone around him. A pair of news anchors whose relationship was one of the show's longest-running slow burns. A recurring cast of bar patrons, school administrators, and neighborhood figures who appeared and disappeared with the specific arbitrariness of a world that cannot fully commit to all of its secondary characters simultaneously. The theory that most of these recurring characters are not simply narrative conveniences but participants in the same institutional network that the CIA universe theory posits is a logical extension of that framework. In a town where the CIA has an active monitoring operation, where multiple residents have classified histories, where the talking dog is an asset and the baby across the street is a remote avatar, the occasional school teacher who knows more than she should, and the television anchor who never seems to age are not simply comedy background. They are the visible surface of a community that is, to a much greater degree than any of its residents have been told, being managed. The specific choice of Rhode Island as the setting is itself worth at least a moment's consideration. Rhode Island is the smallest state in the Union. It is the one that is most easily overlooked, most consistently treated as an afterthought, most stereotyped as an interesting anomaly rather than taken seriously as a place with its own history and character. It is, in the specific way that small places that know they are overlooked sometimes are, deeply aware of itself. The choice to set a show about a family that is routinely overlooked and underestimated in a state that is routinely overlooked and underestimated is either coincidence or the kind of thing that looks like coincidence until you think about it for long enough that it stops looking like coincidence. Meg Griffin lives in Rhode Island, the smallest, most easily ignored state, the one that everyone forgets to include on the maps, the one that has to keep reminding the rest of the country that it exists and matters. She has more in common with her geography than the show probably intended, which is another way of saying that sometimes the connections you find in a story are not the ones that were planted there on purpose, but they are real all the same. Section 16. Numbers, canon, and the question of what the show knows. Any comprehensive survey of Family Guy fan theories has to eventually address the meta-question that runs underneath all of them. How much of what we are finding was actually placed there? This is a question that never has a clean answer for any long-running collaborative work of fiction. Family Guy is not the product of a single author's total control. It is the product of a writing room that changed substantially over the years, of multiple showrunners with different sensibilities, of a creator who was deeply involved in the early seasons and progressively less involved as time went on. There is no single person who can tell you with authority what the show knows and what it stumbled into. There is no author to ask whether the inconsistency in Who Can Hear Stewie was intentional or accidental, whether the cutaway from partial terms of endearment was a genuine hint or a throwaway line that a theory community later decided to treat as evidence. What we can say is that the show has demonstrated awareness of its own fan theories on multiple occasions. The episode Back to the Pilot is the most obvious example. It takes the show directly to the question of the pre- and post-cancellation discontinuity, the question that the parallel universe theory is built around, and it engages with that question through comedy rather than resolving it with clarity. That engagement suggests that the people making the show were aware of what viewers were saying. It does not tell us whether they were confirming the theory or poking fun at it, or both, or neither. The fourth wall breaking that became increasingly frequent in the later seasons is another form of meta-engagement that the theories have to navigate. When characters in the show acknowledge that they are on a television program, acknowledge the show's declining quality, make jokes about the writer's specific creative decisions, the show is performing a kind of self-awareness that could mean many things. It could be genuine self-criticism wrapped in comedy. It could be preemptive acknowledgement of problems the writers knew existed but were unable to fix. It could be the show asserting control over the narrative of its own decline by being the first to name it. It could be all three simultaneously. The theories in engaging with this self-awareness have to decide how much weight to give it. Is the show's acknowledgement of its own reset button problem a clue that the reset button was always intentional? Or is it simply the show noticing, belatedly, that the audience had noticed something and deciding to name it before anyone could claim the naming? The theories that find purgatorial or psychological explanations for the reset button treat the in-show self-awareness as confirmation. The theories that argue for the parallel universe treat it as a distraction from the structural discontinuity. Neither reading is obviously wrong. What is clear is that the show accumulated, over decades, enough material to support multiple coherent and internally consistent readings that go far beyond what any individual viewer watching any individual episode would be likely to produce. The richness of the theory landscape is a function of the show's longevity and complexity, of the sheer volume of episodes that can be cross-referenced, of the specific kinds of inconsistency that the show produced, which were of the variety that invites explanation rather than simply confuses. The theories are not authorially sanctioned readings of the show. They are readings that the show's material made possible, constructed by people who cared enough to look. That distinction matters, but it doesn't make the readings less interesting or less valuable. Some of the most important things ever said about a piece of fiction were not what the author intended. They were what an attentive reader found when they looked carefully enough to see what was actually there. The Peter's broken mind theory was not in Seth MacFarlane's pitch to Fox in 1998. The purgatory theory was not in the original show Bible. The CIA universe was probably never discussed in those terms in any writing room meeting. But the material that made these theories possible was created by people working under the pressure of time and the demands of weekly comedy production. People who made choices for immediate reasons and then moved on, leaving those choices in the accumulated record of the show for someone else to eventually examine. The examination produced these theories. The theories are not the show, but they are, in their own right, something that the show made possible. And something that was made possible by this show, and by this specific community of viewers thinking carefully about this specific fictional world, has its own kind of value. It is the value of paying attention, of taking seriously things that are offered as entertainment and finding in them the outline of something more, of sitting with the darkness of the Peter theory and feeling what it would mean if a man's grief could take this form, of sitting with the sweetness of the Stewie theory and feeling what it would mean if all the strange things we see are the perception of a very young child doing his absolute best to understand the world he arrived in. Those are real feelings, produced by real engagement with real material. Even if the material is an animated comedy about a fictional family in a fictional town that doesn't exist on any map, that is what fiction is for. Section 17. The road to episodes Stewie and Brian as a mirror for everything. No survey of the theories surrounding Family Guy would be complete without a specific extended look at the Road to episodes, the special installments of the show that took Brian and Stewie out of the normal Quahog setting and sent them on adventures together. These episodes began with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, continued through Road to Europe in Season 3, and proliferated across the show's run to include Road to Rupert, Road to Germany, Road to the Multiverse, Road to the North Pole, Road to Vegas, and others. They are, by widespread agreement among fans and critics alike, consistently the best episodes the show produced at any point in its run. Why? The question is worth asking carefully, because the answer illuminates something important about what the show was doing when it was doing its best work. The Road to episodes work because they strip away everything that went wrong with the show in its later seasons and leave only the things that were always right. They remove the cutaway dependency entirely, or nearly so. They build plots that have actual momentum, that develop through scenes rather than interrupting themselves. They place two characters with strong and complementary but genuinely different personalities in situations that require them to rely on each other, which is the fundamental engine of character comedy. And they allow the show to be emotionally direct in ways that the main episodes, with their constant recourse to irony and distance and comic deflection, almost never permitted. The friendship between Brian and Stewie, which has been the show's most genuine and most sustained emotional relationship across its entire run, regardless of what else was happening with the other characters, is at its most clearly expressed in these episodes. The theories around this friendship, which overlap with several of the larger structural theories we have examined, consistently identify it as the show's most honest thing. The one relationship that was never sacrificed to the demands of flanderization or shock comedy, or the relentless pressure to produce something louder and more extreme than last week. In the infant perception framework, this friendship is the relationship at the center of the entire show's reality. In the purgatory framework, it is the mechanism through which Stewie is being corrected, because genuine love and genuine care for another person are the things that the dictator in him needed to learn. In the Brian as CIA experiment framework, it is the one fully human relationship available to a consciousness trapped in a form that prevents most human relationships. The attachment of a kind of parent or sibling figure, improbable and real, that gives the consciousness in the dog something to live for beyond the management of its own impossibility. The Road 2 episodes are the show at full extension. They are what Family Guy would have been if every episode had been made with the same care and the same willingness to prioritize the relationship between these two characters over the demands of weekly comedy production. The theories that use them as evidence, as the parallel universe theory does in citing them as proof that the show could sustain longer-form storytelling, and as the infant perception theory does in treating the best moments from them as windows into the actual emotional reality beneath the show's surface, are pointing at something real. These episodes are different. They have always been different. And what makes them different is the same thing that makes the best fan theories different from the worst ones. Attention, care, the willingness to believe that what you are making is worth taking seriously. The Brian and Stewie Locked in the Vault episode from Season 8, which we have mentioned in the context of the infant perception theory, belongs to the same category as the Road 2 episodes even though it is not technically one of them. Its decision to remove all of the show's defensive layers, all of the comedy machinery that keeps the emotional content at arm's length, and to simply have two characters be honest with each other in a confined space, is among the most significant creative decisions the show ever made. It produced the episode that is cited most frequently by fans and critics and by the theories that grew up around the show, as the closest the show ever came to its own deepest potential. Brian tells Stewie in that episode that he keeps a gun in a safety deposit box because there are times when the thought of using it on himself has not seemed entirely wrong to him. Stewie responds by telling Brian that if he did that, he would be alone. Not that Brian shouldn't do it, not a lecture about the value of life, just the fact of what it would mean, I would be alone. It is the statement of someone for whom this particular relationship is the anchoring thing, the thing that makes the world navigable, and who has not yet developed the emotional vocabulary to express that except through the simplest possible statement of its consequence. In any theory about what the show actually is, that moment is the center. Whatever the show is, however you frame it, whether it is Peter's grief dream or purgatory, or a baby's perception of the world, or a parallel universe, or a CIA operation, or the writing of a conscience in a dog's body, that moment is what the show was trying to reach. The friendship between an impossibly intelligent baby and an impossibly intelligent dog, alone together in the dark, one of them holding a piece of information the other needed to have and giving it simply, without ornament, in the only form in which it would land. You would be alone. That is the emotional truth at the center of a show that spent most of its run hiding from emotional truth. The theories found it. The theories were always looking for it. And when the show, in its best moments, pointed directly at it, the theories in the show were finally pointing at the same thing. Section 18. The Theology of Quahog Death, God, and the show's strange metaphysics. Family Guy has always had an unusual relationship with death and the metaphysical. Death itself is a recurring character who appears on the show with the voice and demeanor of a slightly put-upon middle manager who would rather be anywhere else. God appears occasionally, rendered in a specific visual style that makes him look like an elderly man with white hair and beard. The devil shows up. Angels make cameos. The afterlife has been visited more than once, and on each visit it has looked slightly different from how it looked on the previous visit, which is either an oversight or a theological argument. The fan theories around the show's metaphysics tend to focus on what these appearances mean for the show's cosmological framework. If death is real, as a character who can be interacted with and negotiated with, what does that mean for the nature of life and death in Quahog? If God exists in the show's universe and is available for conversation and occasional interference, what does the continued suffering of the Griffin family imply about his relationship with them? Why does a God who is evidently real and evidently interested in human affairs allow the specific conditions of Quahog to persist? The purgatory theory, in its most developed theological form, answers this directly. God's presence in the show and death's presence in the show are entirely consistent with the show taking place in a space that is adjacent to the normal world but not identical to it. Purgatory is traditionally understood as a domain in which divine judgment operates through circumstance rather than direct intervention, in which the corrective process is built into the environment rather than imposed from outside. If Quahog is that kind of space, then God's occasional appearances are not intrusions from outside the frame but expressions of the frame's own nature. He is there because it's his domain. Death is there because the proximity to mortality that purgatory implies makes the figure of death not a visitor but a resident. The theory also addresses the show's specific version of heaven and hell, which have appeared in episodes with varying degrees of seriousness. Heaven, in Family Guy episodes that have visited it, tends to look like a slightly improved version of ordinary life. Similar social structures, similar pleasures, similar frustrations, just more of the good things and fewer of the bad ones. Hell, in contrast, tends to be organized specifically around irony, people experiencing for eternity the specific things they valued too much in life, or the specific things they caused for others. The theological structure of the show, when it is being theologically coherent, is a structure of appropriate consequence, of matching punishment to behavior, of a universe that remembers what people did and calibrates their experience accordingly. This is, of course, exactly the structure of the purgatory theory. The theory didn't invent a theological framework for the show. It noticed that the show had one and drew the conclusion that follows logically from it. The recurring presence of the devil, who has appeared in a small number of episodes to offer deals and temptations, and the specific kind of contract that has a catch the signatory didn't notice until it was too late, adds another layer. In a world where the devil is real and available for business dealings, the stakes of the moral choices the characters make are higher than they appear in the moment. Peter's various foolish decisions and Quagmire's various moral failures and Brian's progressive self-destruction are all happening in a universe where moral accounting is real and where someone is keeping track. Whether that tracking is the mechanism of the purgatory theory or simply the background radiation of a world where supernatural moral authority exists is left appropriately ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is that the show's metaphysics are richer and stranger than a casual viewing would suggest. The theories that engage with them are, in their way, the show's own spiritual life. The questions the show asks but doesn't answer, given form and direction by the people who cared enough to pursue them past the moment of asking. Section 19, Stewie's Future, the episodes that showed us who he becomes. Among the evidence that fan theories about Stewie draw on, some of the most striking comes from the episodes that take the unusual step of showing the future. Several episodes of Family Guy have depicted Stewie as an adult at various points in his projected future life. And what those depictions show is not always consistent, but is consistently interesting. In Stewie Griffin, The Untold Story, which aired as a direct-to-video special and was later aired in 3 parts as Season 4 episodes, an adult version of Stewie is depicted. This adult Stewie is not the world-dominating villain that the baby Stewie's trajectory might have suggested. He is something more complicated and more subdued, a person who has made certain life choices, who has a certain kind of relationship with his own identity, who is navigating adulthood with the same intelligence and the same fundamental loneliness that characterized the baby version, but without the grandiosity that the baby version used to manage that loneliness. The adult Stewie of this episode is recognizably continuous with the early Stewie in his intelligence and his emotional complexity, but he is not the conqueror or the world destroyer. He is simply a person. The theories that use these future Stewie depictions to argue about the show's implications for his character arc tend to focus on what was lost between the evil genius baby of the early seasons and the complicated adult of the future episodes. The answer that most theories arrive at is, nothing was lost. The future Stewie is not a diminished version of the original. He is the original Stewie, having grown up, having had the sharp edges of his ambition worn down by the accumulated weight of ordinary experience, having found that the desire to conquer and dominate was a response to a particular kind of powerlessness that the passage of time was going to address whether or not he built any weapons. He was going to grow up. Infants who feel completely powerless and respond by constructing elaborate fantasies of total control always, eventually, grow up. The purgatory theory finds in this a specific and moving resolution. The Stewie who began as a dictator trapped in an infant's body, condemned to feel the specific powerlessness he had inflicted on others, grew slowly towards something that resembled wisdom. Not because he was instructed to grow, not because someone intervened, but because the accumulation of genuine love, genuine connection, genuine care for another person, the kind that he developed with Brian across seasons of their friendship, is the thing that the dictator in him needed. You cannot sustain the psychological architecture of domination when you have learned how to genuinely care about someone. The two things are incompatible, and Stewie, over the course of the show, learned to genuinely care about Brian. That is the purgatory working. That is the correction achieving something. The infant perception theory reads the future Stewie episodes differently but arrives at a similarly hopeful place. If the show is filtered through Stewie's perception, then these glimpses of his adult self are what an infant imagines when he projects himself forward into time. The adult he constructs is not the conqueror he might have predicted from the urgency of his infant desires. It is something more modest and more honest. A person. A person who has the intelligence he always had, and the loneliness he always had, and the capacity for love he always had. The infant imagines his adult self truly, which is to say, not as triumphant, not as vindicated, not as having gotten everything he wanted, but as real. That is actually quite a remarkable thing for a show to have built into one of its most outlandish characters. A baby who imagines himself growing up not into glory, but into ordinary, complicated, real personhood. That is not nothing. That is the show being wise in a way it was not always given credit for being. Section 20. The question of Meg, why she matters more than the show knew. We have come back to Meg Griffin several times across this evening's exploration, and that is as it should be, because Meg is the character around whom the most interesting tension in the show's fan theory community collects. She is the character who generated the most protective theories, the most determined readings against the grain, the most sustained insistence on the part of her defenders that she is more than the show made of her. The theories about Meg are of two broad types. The first type takes the show's treatment of her as a given and tries to explain it. Why is she treated this way? What does it mean? The Peter Grief theory explains it as unconscious resentment. The purgatory theory explains it as her role in the corrective apparatus. The secret mother theory gives it a specific biographical cause. These theories do not dispute that Meg is mistreated. They explain the mistreatment by placing it in a framework that makes it legible. The second type of theory is more assertive. It argues not just that there is an explanation for Meg's mistreatment, but that Meg herself, as a character, is the show's hidden center. That everything in the show orbits around her in ways that nobody, including the writers, fully recognized. That Meg is not the punchline but the point. This theory has its most articulate version in an argument made across multiple forums that begins from the observation that Meg is the only member of the Griffin family who responds to her situation with anything approaching wisdom. She endures. She doesn't harden into cruelty the way Peter does. She doesn't retreat into self-justifying pretension the way Brian does. She doesn't abandon her essential goodness the way the show slowly strips goodness from almost every other character as it goes on. She remains, season after season, fundamentally and stubbornly intact. Hurt, certainly. Marked by the years of difficulty. But not destroyed. Not transformed into a worse version of herself. The theory argues that this is not accidental. That the writers, however inconsistently and however often they stepped back from the implications of what they were building, were constructing in Meg the figure of someone who survives. Someone who takes everything the world throws at her and remains, at the end of it, herself. Someone for whom the capacity for endurance is not a failure of resistance but a form of strength that the show's other characters, with their louder and more dramatic responses to their circumstances, never quite achieve. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party, which is cited in the show's critical literature as one of the most controversial episodes in its run because of how it resolves its premise, is the most direct engagement the show ever had with this reading of Meg. In that episode, Meg confronts her family, speaks her truth, names what has been done to her, and then she takes it back. She accepts that her role is to absorb the family's frustrations so that they can remain functional. She walks back into the position of the punching bag deliberately and with full awareness. The critics who found this unacceptable read it as the show endorsing the abuse. The theory that positions Meg as the show's hidden center reads it differently. It reads it as the show acknowledging, in the only register available to it given its own creative limitations, that some people choose sacrifice. That some people understand their context well enough to know that their functioning is necessary for the people around them, and that they choose, with full awareness, to pay the cost. This is not the same as endorsing what is being done to her. It is an acknowledgement that she sees clearly and acts on what she sees, which is more than any other character in the episode can claim. Meg Griffin is the most fully conscious person in the show. She is the one who knows what is happening, who has the clearest-eyed assessment of the situation, and who makes a decision about what to do with that assessment. The decision is painful and possibly wrong, but it is a decision made with full information and full awareness. The other characters respond to their situations with denial, with grandiosity, with self-destruction, with impulsiveness, with the various defensive mechanisms that prevent a person from actually seeing clearly. Meg sees clearly, and then she acts. That is not the behavior of a punchline. That is the behavior of the show's moral center. The character who, by virtue of having nothing to protect, no status or pretension or self-image that she's been allowed to maintain, can afford to see things as they actually are and respond accordingly. The fan theories that care most about Meg are the ones that understood this earliest. They insisted on it when the show was at its worst, when the abuse was at its most extreme and the resolution was at its most absent. They held the space for her to be more than what the show was making her in those years. And eventually, slowly, partially, the show came around. The additions to the writing staff who pushed back against the treatment, the episodes in the later seasons that gave her actual character development, the gradual pulling back of the cruelty, the theories came first. The show followed, imperfectly and too late, but followed, which is maybe the best argument for what theories are for. They hold the space for what a story could be until the story catches up to the people who were already imagining it. Section 11. B. Further dimensions of the hive mind. What Peter knows without knowing. The hive mind theory, which we introduced in its core form in the previous section, has several extensions that deserve careful attention because they address specific elements of the show that the basic version of the theory handles but doesn't fully explain. The first extension concerns Peter's emotional patterns. A consciousness connected to thousands of parallel selves would not simply have access to memories and experiences from other timelines. It would also carry something of the emotional residue of those other lives. Other Peters have experienced grief, have loved deeply, have suffered losses, have had moments of genuine clarity and genuine connection that the Peter we follow in this particular branch of reality has not experienced in the same form. Those emotional textures, arriving as diffuse impressions from the hive's broader field, would register as something in Peter's emotional life without being attached to any specific memory he could point to and say, that is where this feeling came from. This might explain the specific quality of Peter's occasional moments of genuine feeling, the moments when he is tender with Lois in a way that seems to come from nowhere. The moments when his love for his family surfaces through the comedy in a form that feels more real than the surrounding material. These are not the product of character development in this timeline. They are the emotional echo of character development in other timelines. Other Peters who went through the version of events that produced genuine wisdom and genuine growth, their experience leaking through the hive's connection into this Peter who is, in his own timeline, still primarily the man-child we know. He feels things he doesn't have the biographical context to explain. The hive knows what he doesn't. The second extension addresses Stewie's time machine in relation to the hive mind. If Peter is connected to every version of himself across every universe, and if Stewie is his son in this universe, at minimum, then the time machine is operating in a cosmological space that the hive is already navigating constantly. Stewie doesn't need to understand the physics of multidimensional travel to build a device that enables it. He is, in some diffuse and hard-to-articulate sense, building in the direction of something that the hive mind, which he inherited in some partial form from Peter, already knows how to find. The machine is not invented. It is remembered from the version of Peter's hive that includes the timelines where the machine was built before. The third extension, and the most emotionally interesting, addresses what happens to the hive when a version of Peter dies in one of the parallel timelines. The hive doesn't die. The hive is distributed across infinite instances, and the loss of one instance, however locally significant, does not diminish the whole. But the specific instance of this Peter, the one we follow, would presumably register something when another version of himself is lost, a kind of diffuse and unexplained grief. A sense of absence that has no object he can point to in his own life. The show has Peter occasionally express melancholy that seems to have no cause, seems to arise from nowhere, seems to be disproportionate to whatever triggered it in the immediate plot. The Hive theory offers an explanation. He is mourning someone he doesn't remember, grieving a life he didn't live, feeling the loss of a version of himself who ceased to exist somewhere in the vast field of what he is. Peter Griffin is, in this framework, the most unknowingly sad character in the show. He carries within him the accumulated losses of infinite lives without the ability to access the specific context that would explain what he's feeling or where it comes from. He just feels it, diffusely and persistently, and expresses it the only way available to him, by being loud and impulsive and occasionally, underneath everything, surprisingly tender. Interlude. On the nature of fan theories themselves. Before continuing to the final sections of this evening's exploration, it is worth pausing to think carefully about what fan theories actually are and why they take the forms they take around particular shows. Fan theories are not unique to Family Guy. They exist around virtually every long-running piece of popular fiction that generates a committed audience. The Simpsons, Breaking Bad, the Marvel Universe, Harry Potter, Star Wars, and dozens of other properties. But the theories that attach to Family Guy have a specific character that distinguishes them from theories around shows with tighter internal consistency and more coherent authorial vision. The theories around Family Guy are almost always explanatory rather than predictive. Theories about Breaking Bad tended to ask where the story was going, what would happen next, how the ending would resolve. Theories about Family Guy almost never ask what will happen next, because the show's relationship with its own narrative future has always been too loose for prediction to be satisfying. Instead, they ask what already happened, what the events and relationships and inconsistencies of the existing episodes mean, what the best framework is for making sense of a world that has never been fully coherent. This is the theoretical mode of a show whose audience has given up on forward momentum and become very interested instead in retrospective coherence. The theories are essentially an act of retroactive editing, finding the version of the show that would be the best version of itself if you applied the right interpretive frame. The Peter Grief theory is the version of Family Guy that would justify every element of the show's tone and structure if it were true. The Purgatory theory is the version that would give the stasis a reason. The parallel universe theory is the version that would resolve the discontinuity between eras without requiring you to accept that the show simply deteriorated. None of these theories are editing the show in any literal sense. The actual episodes are what they are. But the theories edit the experience of the show, which is the more important kind of editing in the end, because the experience is what matters. The theories take what is on screen and place it in a context that makes it better. That is not a small thing. It is arguably exactly what good criticism does with any work of art. Not change the work, but change the context in which it is experienced, and thereby change what it means to the person experiencing it. The fan theory community around Family Guy has been doing this for 25 years. The work they produced, the theories that have been shared and refined and built upon and argued about, is a form of collaborative criticism that has no institutional home and no formal recognition, but that has, for the people who participated in it and the people who encountered it, genuinely mattered. That is worth acknowledging. Whatever the theories get right and whatever they miss, they are evidence of the most important thing a piece of art can produce. An audience that cared enough to keep thinking. Section 20b. The minor figures and what they carry. Every theory about the major characters in Family Guy implies something about the minor ones. If Quahog is a purgatorial space, then the minor characters are also serving their sentences or administering the environment of others' sentences. If Quahog is a CIA operation, then the recurring background figures are also assets or civilians or administrators of the operation. If Quahog is Peter's dream, then the minor characters are the inhabitants of the dream, shaped by the same unconscious forces that shaped the major ones. Tom Tucker, the news anchor, is one of the more interesting minor figures because his specific qualities, his vanity, his willingness to deliver any story with the same flat affect, regardless of its emotional content, his complicated personal life, which the show occasionally references, map onto multiple theoretical frameworks with interesting results. In the Purgatory reading, he is a man whose professional confidence has been given to him in a context where it can never be earned. A news anchor in a town where the news is always chaos and always eventually absurd, forever delivering with total seriousness material that undermines itself. The purgatorial punishment for a certain kind of unearned self-assurance is to be eternally serious in a world that will not sustain seriousness. Quagmires. Quagmire, the specific way he has been understood by the show's fan theory community, is more than simply a man with a problematic relationship with women. He is, in several theories, a person whose basic human capacity for connection was damaged by experiences he carries but cannot fully access. His friendships with Peter, Joe, and Cleveland are, in these readings, the most important thing he has. People who accept him, who know him, who have chosen to remain in his vicinity despite everything. The specific way that Quagmire's friendship with Peter is handled in the show, the complicated dynamic in which Peter is often thoughtless or destructive toward his friends, but Quagmire consistently shows up and stays, suggests a man who has learned that the people who stay are rare enough to be held onto regardless of cost. In the hive mind framework, the minor characters are the peripheral nodes of Peter's multiversal awareness. Each of them reflects, in some diffuse way, a type of person or a kind of experience that some version of Peter encountered in some branch of the multiverse. Their specific qualities, the things that make each of them particular and recognizable, are distillations of Peter's accumulated experience of similar kinds of people across thousands of parallel lives. This is perhaps why the show's recurring background characters feel, at their best, like they have histories, even when those histories are never shown. Because in the hive mind framework, they do. Just not histories that belong to this particular universe's version of them. Section 21. Closing the door. A final meditation on what Quahog means. The lights of Quahog are on. They are always on, if you know where to look for them. Not the lights in the windows of the real Providence, Rhode Island, which is a real city with real people who have their own real stories and who owe nothing to this imagined version of a neighboring town. But the lights in the version of Rhode Island that 25 years of an animated show built in the minds of the people who watched it, those lights don't go off. They stay on in the specific way that fictional places stay lit long after the episode has ended and the screen has gone dark. What we have been doing tonight is looking at those lights, walking through the theories that people have built to explain the strange and the dark and the wonderful and the unexplained in what those lights illuminate. We have sat with grief theories and cosmological theories and CIA conspiracy theories and psychological theories and theological theories and theories about the nature of time and reality and consciousness. We have followed the evidence that fans gathered across years of careful attention to a show that did not always treat that attention with the respect it deserved. And what we found, at the center of all of them, is the same thing. Every major theory, regardless of how different its specific mechanism, regardless of whether it is dark or playful or devastating or strange, arrives ultimately at the same question. What does it mean to love something that causes you pain? What does it mean to stay in a world that doesn't always make sense? What does it mean to keep being yourself when everything around you is trying to make you into something simpler or harder or less? Peter, in the grief theory, loves a family he has lost. The love doesn't end with the loss. It builds him a world where they are still alive, still present, still real. The love is the engine of the dream. Stewie, in the perception theory, loves the dog who talks back to him. Loves him the way that very young children love the things that make the world feel safe. Not because the dog earned that love through any particular virtue. Because the love was there, and the dog was there, and the love found its home. Brian loves a version of himself he cannot sustain. Loves the idea of what he could be if the circumstances were different. The alcoholism and the pretension and the progressive deterioration are the result of loving something, an image of himself as a genuine intellectual and writer of merit, that the circumstances of his existence make perpetually out of reach. The love is real. The thing it's reaching for is real. The distance between them is what causes the harm. Meg loves people who hurt her, and chooses, with full awareness, to keep loving them. Because what else is there? Because the love is hers to give regardless of what is given back. Because at the very bottom of everything, the love is what she has that nobody can take. Stewie and Brian love each other with the specific and irreplaceable quality of the best friendships, completely, improbably, across every category that should make them strangers to each other. An infant and a dog. A consciousness in a baby's body and a consciousness in a dog's. Whatever they are, they found each other in the same impossible space, and they stayed. These are not small things. These are the things that every story is ultimately about, whether it knows it or not. Family Guy has been many things over 25 years. It has been brilliant and lazy and mean and warm and self-aware and oblivious and innovative and derivative. It has taken its characters to places that diminish them and to places that illuminated them. It has earned enormous loyalty from its audience, and has sometimes spent that loyalty carelessly and sometimes honored it. And throughout all of it, in the edges and the corners and the moments that the theories have been finding for decades, there have been these questions. These real, serious human questions about love and loss and what we build when we lose things and what we become when the world is too hard to take at face value and what it means to stay, to keep showing up, to be in the room next week even when this week ended badly. The theories are the audience staying in the room, the audience showing up, bringing attention and care to something that they found, somewhere in its complicated history, worth attending to carefully. Whatever Family Guy is, it made that possible. Whatever its failures, and they are real and documented and discussed at length, it created a world that people wanted to understand rather than simply consume. It built characters that people wanted to know better than the show itself chose to make them known. It planted something in the culture that grew into 2.5 decades of engagement that continues now, continues tonight, continues in this room wherever you are watching from. That is the thing about stories. The ones that matter don't end when the screen goes dark. They go on in the space between what was shown and what was implied, in the theories built from the evidence, in the questions asked at 2 in the morning by people who found that they cared more about a fictional family than any fictional family probably deserved. In you, right now, wherever you are, listening. The lights are on. Quahog is there, in whatever form it actually exists, and the family is together. And somewhere in the nursery, the baby is building something in the dark, something that clicks and hums with purpose, something that is going to take him somewhere. He doesn't know yet where it will go, but he is building it carefully, with the absolute seriousness of someone who believes it will work. And maybe that's all any of us are doing, every time we try to understand the things we love. Building something in the dark, something that might take us somewhere. Rest well. The dream goes on. If this video carried you through the night and gave you something interesting to drift towards sleep with, hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Leave a comment with the theory that surprised you most, the one that is still turning over in your mind. We read every single one. Thank you for being here. Sweet dreams wherever you are. Section 22. The show that knows it is a show meta-awareness and its implications. One of the more unusual features of Family Guy's later seasons is the increasing frequency with which the show acknowledges its own existence as a television program. This meta-awareness, which operates on a spectrum from winking jokes about the show's long run to episodes that fully commit to the premise that the Griffins are actors playing characters, has generated its own cluster of theories about what it means for everything else. The most basic version of the meta-awareness theory is simply that the fourth wall breaks are a sign that the show has grown sophisticated enough about itself to comment on its own structure and limitations. Under this reading, when Peter addresses the camera directly, or when a character makes a joke about the show's declining ratings, or when the episode explicitly acknowledges that what's happening follows the logic of television rather than the logic of life, these are moments of genuine self-awareness in the creative work. The show knows what it is. It chooses to acknowledge that it knows. And the acknowledgement is a form of honesty. The more interesting reading, which connects to the actor theory about Stewie and the show within a show framework, is that the meta-awareness is not self-commentary by the actual show but is instead part of the fictional world. The Griffins are actors in a fictional television show that exists within their reality. When they break the fourth wall, they are not breaking out of the fiction into the real world of the actual show. They are breaking out of the fictional show within their world into the larger fictional world they actually inhabit. The fourth wall breaks are not the actual show acknowledging itself. They are the fictional show within the fictional world acknowledging its own fictional status. This creates a structure that is genuinely vertiginous if you follow it carefully. The actual show contains a fictional world. Within that fictional world, there exists a fictional television show called Family Guy. The characters of the fictional world are actors on the fictional show. When those characters appear to break the fourth wall and speak to the actual audience, they are speaking to the fictional audience of the fictional show within the fictional world. The actual show is therefore a documentary, of a kind, about the making of the fictional show. The audience watching the actual show is watching footage of a fictional world's fictional television production, which they mistake for direct address. The episode Inside Family Guy, which is the most explicit engagement with this framework, is therefore not a single layer of meta-commentary but a nested structure of several layers simultaneously. The actual show produces an episode in which the fictional characters play actors playing the fictional characters for a fictional behind-the-scenes documentary that exists within the fictional world. The actual audience watches this and is uncertain at each moment which layer they are in. This is not an accident. This is a show that, whatever its other failures, understood on some level that the question of what level of reality any given moment is occurring on is itself an interesting question. The theories that engage with this structure are not reading too much into a joke. They are taking seriously something that the show was, in its own comedic and often clumsy way, taking seriously too. The question of what level of reality we are in when we watch Family Guy is the same question the show has always been asking, in the specific way that shows which operate in the space between reality and dream always ask it. Is this real? Is this the dream? Is this the show or the show's show? Is this the grief or the actual life? Is this Stewie's perception or the objective events of the world? The theories say, yes, all of the above. At the same time, the show does not resolve the question, because the question is not resolvable. It is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a condition. The condition of a fictional world rich enough to generate genuine uncertainty about its own nature. The condition of a story told for long enough that it starts to feel more real than the information its audience has about what real means. Quahog is real in the way that the most real things we can access are real. It is inside us. It is part of the language we use to think about certain kinds of problems. It is a map we have learned to read, made of characters who have become as familiar as the people we actually know, in a world whose rules we have been learning for 25 years. The theories are real too, in the same way. Not in the sense of being factually accurate about a fictional place, in the sense of having been genuinely thought by real people in response to something that genuinely affected them. The grief someone felt when Brian died in Season 12. The satisfaction someone found in the parallel universe theory's organization of a discontinuity that had been bothering them for years. The protective anger someone felt toward Meg, and the relief they felt when the later seasons began to treat her with more dignity. Those are real things that happen to real people because of a show. The theories are the record of those real things. The record of the time people spent thinking carefully about something that mattered to them. That is what Quahog is. That is what it has always been. A place where real things happen to real people. Inside. Rest well, the lights are on. Section 23. The songs, the jokes, and the things that stayed. Family Guy has always been a show that operates in register shifts. A scene of genuine emotional weight followed immediately by a cutaway gag. A moment of real character development dissolved into a Conway Twitty performance. A heartfelt exchange between Brian and Stewie interrupted by a callback to a joke from 3 seasons ago. This tonal instability, which critics have identified as one of the show's primary weaknesses, is also one of the things that makes the theories around it so interesting. A show that consistently held its emotional notes would not invite the kind of interpretive searching that this show does. It is the instability that creates the gaps, and the gaps are where the theories live. The musical numbers deserve their own brief consideration because they represent the show at its most deliberately incongruous. Family Guy is not a musical. It has never claimed to be a musical, and yet it has produced, across its run, a substantial number of musical sequences that are genuinely well made, that demonstrate real craft in the writing of lyrics and the staging of songs, that sometimes carry more emotional weight than the surrounding episode. The songs are the show catching itself being sincere and deciding to commit to it rather than undercut it. The theories about the songs tend to focus on what they reveal about the characters who perform them. The musical form, which requires a character to express something they couldn't say in ordinary dialogue, is sometimes the most honest thing a character does in the entire episode. Stewie's songs, in particular, have a quality of genuine feeling underneath the comedy that the non-musical scenes sometimes lack. When Stewie sings, he is saying things that the character's normal register doesn't give him space to say. The theory that the songs are windows into the character's actual interior experience, as opposed to their performed behavior, gives them a function beyond entertainment. They are the moments when the mask comes off, when the defense of comedy is lowered just enough for something real to pass through. The Road to Rhode Island number, in which Brian and Stewie discover Brian's real origins as a dog from a literal dog farm, is probably the most emotionally complex song the show ever produced. It is funny. It is also genuinely sad. It reveals something about Brian's relationship with his own identity, his own history, his own sense of where he belongs in the world, that the episode's non-musical scenes don't directly address. The theory that the song is where Brian's actual feelings live, that the comedy of the surrounding episode is his defense, and the song is what happens when the defense drops, gives the number a resonance that rewards the attention. The songs are small theories in themselves. They are the show saying, "Here, briefly," while the character is singing, is the thing that is actually true. And then the music ends and the comedy reasserts itself, and the mask goes back up and the episode continues. But for the duration of the song, you were inside something real. That has always been enough. It has always been more than enough. And the theories that know how to find it, that know how to sit with the real thing when the show briefly offers it, are the theories that have lasted, the ones that people keep sharing, the ones that keep finding new people who encounter them and feel, for the first time, that they are seeing the show they always suspected was underneath the show they were watching, the show you suspected, the show that the theories found, the show that the lights of Quahog illuminate. Late at night, when everything else is quiet and the only thing moving is the imagination of someone who cared enough to look, that show is real. It has always been real. You just needed the right kind of attention to see it. Now close your eyes. Let the theories settle. Let the town be the town it has always been underneath the comedy and the chaos. A place where people are trying, in their imperfect and sometimes painful ways, to love each other, to stay, to keep showing up even when showing up is hard. Quahog is there. The family is together, the lights are on. Rest well. Section 24. The episode that changed everything and the episode that didn't. Every long-running show has the episode that fans point to as the inflection point, the moment after which the show was definitively one thing rather than another. Family Guy has several candidates for this distinction, and the debates about which episode actually marks the definitive turn are themselves a form of fan theory, a collaborative argument about where the story of the show's history pivots. The most commonly cited candidate is the Season 12 episode Life of Brian, in which Brian is struck by a car and killed. The death was handled with genuine seriousness. The family mourned. Stewie's grief was real and raw, in a way that the show doesn't often allow its emotional moments to be. A new dog named Vinny was introduced, and the show appeared to be committing to a genuine change. Fans across social media expressed everything from stunned sadness to fury at the loss of a character who had been present since the very first episode. And then, 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Brian came back. Stewie traveled back in time to prevent the accident. The death was undone. Vinny vanished from the narrative. Everything returned to exactly where it had been before the death occurred. The response was, in the most accurate word available, betrayal. Not disappointment, which implies a merely unfulfilled expectation. Betrayal, which implies that something promised was taken back. The death of Brian had been presented as real and permanent, in a way that invited real and permanent grief. The resurrection almost immediately converted that grief into a feeling of having been manipulated. The show had used its audience's emotional investment to generate a few weeks of attention, and then handed it back as though the investment had never been made. The theories around this episode cluster around 2 distinct readings. The first reading treats the death and resurrection as evidence for the purgatorial framework. In purgatory, death is not final. The sentence requires continued presence. Brian cannot truly die because the structure of the space he inhabits does not permit permanent exits. His death was as real as deaths in that space are real, which is to say experientially complete but structurally temporary. Stewie's ability to undo it through time travel is not a narrative cheat but a feature of the space's rules. Time is navigable here, and consequences are reversible, and the people serving their sentences cannot simply leave by dying. The second reading treats the death and resurrection as the moment when the show most clearly demonstrated that it valued the appearance of stakes over actual stakes. The death was deployed for attention. The resurrection was deployed because the long-term cost of maintaining the death was too high. The show chose the commercially rational option twice in a row, and in doing so revealed that it would always choose the commercially rational option, which connects, in the theoretical frameworks, to the parallel universe reading. In the universe where Family Guy was creatively driven rather than commercially driven, Brian stayed dead, and the show had to figure out who it was without him. In our universe, it didn't. Both readings are true in their different ways. The death was real, and the resurrection was real, and what they reveal together is the same thing. that all the best theories reveal about this show. It is a place where genuine things try to happen, and the mechanisms of the place, whether those mechanisms are purgatorial or commercial, or the product of a specific and imperfect creative history, prevent them from completing. The genuine things try. They really do. And sometimes they get through. And when they get through, they are the most alive things in the show. The Brian and Stewie in the Vault episode. The best Road to installments. The moments when Meg speaks truly, and the show holds the space for what she says. The musical numbers when the mask comes off. The rare Peter moment when the love gets through the comedy. Those moments happen. They have always happened. The theories found them and preserved them and told people where to look. And the people who looked found something real. The lights are on in Quahog. They have always been on. They will be on when you wake up. Go to sleep.